Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I decided to rent a cabin for a weekend away. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to get some time alone. I found this place online, looked nice enough in the pictures. Small, tucked away in the woods, no neighbors for miles. Exactly what I needed. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The air was cool, and the quiet was almost heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. The cabin was smaller than I expected. The wood was a little worn, the paint on the shutters chipped, but it was clean inside. Cozy, I guess. I unpacked my stuff and settled in, turned on my phone to check the signal. Barely one bar. That was fine. I wasn't planning to be glued to my phone anyway. I brought some books, figured I'd read, maybe take a few walks through the woods. Just relax. The first night was fine. I made myself some pasta, drank a glass of wine, sat on the porch for a while. I could see the stars so clearly out here. I wasn't used to that. It was beautiful. I ended up going to bed early, feeling good about the whole thing. The second day, though, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it exactly. I woke up early, and everything was normal. Had breakfast, sat outside with my coffee, enjoying the quiet. But after a while, I started to feel watched. You know that feeling you get when someone's staring at you? It crept up on me. I kept glancing around, looking out at the trees, but there was nothing there. Just me in the cabin. I brushed it off, thinking it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being this far out in the middle of nowhere, alone. I tried to shake it off, went for a walk along a path that wound through the woods. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. Just trees, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the crunch of my own footsteps on the dirt. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me without even thinking. I didn't know why, but I felt safer with it locked. I made lunch, but I couldn't sit still. I kept pacing around the cabin, checking the windows, looking out into the woods. I felt stupid, like I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I noticed the camera. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, trying to calm down, when something caught my eye. A small black dot in the corner of the ceiling, barely noticeable. I stood up and walked over to it. It was a camera. Tiny, but definitely a camera. My stomach dropped. I scanned the room, my eyes darting around, trying to spot more. There was another one above the door, and another in the kitchen, tucked up in the corner, just out of sight. I felt sick. I ran into the bedroom. There was one in there too, right above the bed. Who the hell was watching me? I grabbed my phone, tried to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. I ran outside, thinking I could drive down the road a bit, find a spot where I could make a call. But when I got to my car, my blood turned cold. All 4 tires were flat. It wasn't just one tire, it was all of them. Someone had slashed them. I was trapped. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me again. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only thing I could think of to protect myself, and sat on the couch, my back to the wall, facing the door. I kept looking at the cameras, feeling more and more exposed. Whoever had set them up could see everything. They were watching me. They knew I'd found them. I tried to think, tried to come up with a plan, but all I could do was sit there, waiting for something to happen. The sun started to set, and the cabin got darker. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want whoever was watching to know where I was, even though they probably already did. I sat there in the dark, gripping the knife, listening for any sound outside. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, made me jump. Hours passed. Nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just waiting for the right moment. I kept glancing at the cameras, feeling like they were closing in on me, like they were more than just little black dots on the ceiling. They were eyes, watching, waiting. Then I heard it. A faint sound outside, like footsteps. My heart stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I stood up, knife in hand, and crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. There was someone out there. A shadow, moving just beyond the tree line. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, not with the tires slashed. I couldn't call for help, not without a signal. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was out there. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and steady. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then there was a knock. Soft at first, then louder. Whoever was out there was knocking on the door. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The knocking continued, steady, insistent. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. I crept towards the door, pressing my ear against it, listening. I could hear breathing on the other side, slow and calm, like they were waiting for me to open it. I backed away, shaking. I wasn't going to open that door. No way. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door, back around the side of the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, completely alone, with no way to call for help. Whoever was out there was still watching me, waiting. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. The woods were silent again. But I knew they weren't gone. They were still out there, watching, waiting for the next move. And I was trapped in this cabin, with nowhere to go. I stayed up all night, knife in hand, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. The next morning, when the sun finally came up, I grabbed my stuff and ran. I didn't care about the flat tires. I wasn't staying another minute in that place. I managed to flag down a car on the road and got a ride to the nearest town. I never looked back. I still don't know who was watching me, or what they wanted, but I'm just glad I got out when I did. I was driving back from a work trip late at night, somewhere around the middle of nowhere. The kind of stretch of road where you don't see another car for miles, and the radio barely picks up a signal. I wasn't in any rush to get home. I had a coffee with me, the windows down a bit to keep myself awake, and the road was empty enough that I just let my thoughts drift. It must have been close to midnight when I saw him on the side of the road, standing by the guardrail with his thumb out. He looked normal enough, jeans, jacket, just a guy trying to get somewhere. I'd never picked up a hitchhiker before, but I was feeling generous or maybe just tired of the quiet. I pulled over a few feet ahead of him and waited as he jogged up to the car. He opened the door and gave me a smile, the kind that seemed polite enough but didn't quite reach his eyes. His hair was messy, and there was dirt on his shoes like he'd been walking for a while. "Thanks, man," he said as he climbed in. "Not a lot of people stop anymore." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road a bit. Anywhere you're going is good enough for me." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. He settled into the passenger seat, and for a few minutes, we drove in silence. It wasn't awkward, just quiet. The kind of quiet you get when you don't know someone but don't want to ask too many questions either. He stared out the window, tapping his fingers on his knee in a slow, steady rhythm. "Been out here long?" I finally asked, just to break the silence. "Couple hours, I guess," he replied, his voice flat. "Had a ride earlier, but they were going in the wrong direction." I nodded, not really sure what to say to that. There was something about him that was starting to put me on edge, but I couldn't put my finger on why. He seemed normal enough. Maybe it was just the fact that it was so late, and I was tired. "So," he said after a while, turning to face me, "you pick up hitchhikers often?" "Not really," I admitted. "First time, actually." He chuckled, a low sound that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. "First time, huh? Must be my lucky night." I forced a smile but didn't say anything. Something about the way he said that rubbed me the wrong way, but I told myself I was overreacting. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. He didn't say anything for a few minutes after that, just kept tapping his fingers on his knee. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "You ever meet someone and just know they've done bad things?" I glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, still staring straight ahead. "You know, some people, you can just tell. They've done things. Hurt people. Killed people, maybe." My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to play it off. "I guess. I don't really think about it." He chuckled again, that same low sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Yeah, most people don't. But I can always tell." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the road. My fingers tightened on the wheel again. "You can?" "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "You get a feeling. Like something's off about them. Like they're carrying something heavy inside." I didn't respond, didn't know how to. My mind was racing now, and I was starting to regret picking him up in the first place. There was something about the way he talked, the way he stared out the window, that didn't sit right with me. Like he was playing some kind of game, testing me. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You ever do something you regret?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "No," he asked, turning to look at me. "Never hurt someone? Never thought about it?" I glanced at him, feeling my stomach twist. "No." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Not even once?" I shook my head again, my throat dry. "No." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel his eyes on me, feel the weight of them. I kept my gaze on the road, trying to act like I wasn't freaked out, like my hands weren't shaking on the wheel. But inside, I was panicking. "I have," he said, almost casually. My heart stopped. I didn't say anything, didn't even breathe. He just kept talking, like he was discussing the weather. "Couple years ago, met this guy at a bar. He was mouthing off, you know? Saying things he shouldn't have. I didn't mean to hurt him, not really. Just wanted to shut him up. But things got out of hand. I forced myself to swallow, my mouth dry. What? What happened? He shrugged, looking out the window again. He didn't make it. Cops never found out. It's not hard to hide something like that if you know what you're doing. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to process what he just told me. Was he serious? Was he messing with me? Either way, I was stuck in a car with him, and there was nowhere to go. He turned to look at me again, his eyes dark and unreadable. You ever wonder what it's like to take someone's life? My stomach lurched. No, I said quickly, my voice shaky. He smiled, that same cold smile, and leaned back in his seat. It's not like they show in the movies. It's messy, eh? Louder. But once you do it, you get used to it. It gets easier. I felt sick. My hands were trembling on the wheel now, and I could barely focus on the road. I wanted to pull over, wanted to kick him out of the car, but I was too scared. What if he had a weapon? What if he tried to hurt me? The road ahead was dark and empty, stretching on for miles. There was nowhere to stop, nowhere to go. I was trapped, stuck in this car with him, and I had no idea what he was going to do next. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of his jacket as he shifted in his seat. I kept my eyes on the road, praying that we'd reach a town soon, that I could get away from him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A small gas station, barely more than a couple pumps and a rundown convenience store. My heart leaped into my throat. I slowed the car, pulling into the parking lot, and parked near the entrance. I need to get gas, I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his smile fading. I thought you had a full tank. I swallowed hard, trying to think of an excuse. I want to top it off. Just in case. He stared at me for a moment, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I was sure he could hear it too. Then, after what felt like forever, he shrugged and opened the door. All right, he said, climbing out of the car. Thanks for the ride. I didn't respond, just nodded and watched as he closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, staring at me through the window, that cold smile back on his face. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows behind the gas station. I sat there for a long time, my hands still gripping the wheel, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't until I saw the gas station attendant staring at me through the window that I finally moved. I got out of the car, my legs shaking, and went inside. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about the way he'd looked at me. I don't know if he was serious, or if he was just trying to scare me. We'd been driving for hours. The map app on my phone wasn't working. Every time I tried to get a signal, it would spin and spin, showing nothing but blank space on the screen. Claire, sitting in the passenger seat, was thumbing through a paper map. She was tracing lines with her finger, trying to figure out where the hell we were, but it wasn't helping. I think we took a wrong turn back there, she said, squinting at the map. But I'm not sure where we are now. I let out a sigh, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. We'd been driving through rural Kansas, looking for this little bed and breakfast that some friend of hers had recommended. It was supposed to be cute and out of the way, a nice escape for the weekend. But now it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere, with no towns, no gas stations, nothing. We were low on gas, too. I didn't want to freak Claire out, but the needle was dipping toward empty, and there was no sign of a gas station anywhere. "We should stop and ask for directions," she said. I glanced at her. "Ask who?" "There's no one around." She pointed up ahead. "There's a house." I looked, and sure enough, there was a farmhouse in the distance, sitting back off the road, surrounded by fields. The place looked old, the kind of house you'd expect to see in a black and white photograph. The paint was peeling, the roof sagging, but it didn't look abandoned. There was a faint light in one of the windows. "I don't know," I said. "This place looks weird." "We need gas," Claire reminded me. "Maybe they'll know where the nearest station is." I didn't have much of a choice, so I turned down the dirt driveway, the tires kicking up dust behind us. As we got closer to the house, my stomach started to twist. There was something about the place that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt wrong. The fields around the house were overgrown, wild, and there were old pieces of rusted-out farm equipment scattered around the yard. It looked like no one had taken care of the place in years. I pulled the car up in front of the house and turned off the engine. The silence hit me like a weight. No cars, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled off. "Come on," Claire said, opening her door. I stayed in the car for a second, watching her walk up to the porch. She knocked on the door, 3 sharp taps that echoed in the stillness. I felt a lump forming in my throat. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was old, her skin wrinkled and thin, like paper. Her eyes were pale, almost colorless, and she stared at Claire with this strange, blank expression. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Her voice was raspy, like she hadn't used it in a long time. Claire smiled politely. "Hi, we're a little lost. We were wondering if you could point us to the nearest gas station." The woman didn't respond right away. She just stood there, staring at Claire, her eyes moving slowly over her face, then down to the car, and then to me. I felt a chill run down my spine when her eyes locked onto mine. "There's no gas station nearby," she said finally. "Not for miles." "Do you know the closest town?" Claire asked, shifting awkwardly. "We're running low on gas, and we're not sure where we are." The woman didn't answer that question either. She just turned and called into the house, "Roy." A man appeared in the doorway behind her. He was tall and thin, his face weathered and sunken, with a greasy ball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked at us the same way the woman had, with that strange, blank stare. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. "These folks are lost," the woman said. "Looking for a gas station." Roy grunted, then turned his gaze to me. "Ain't no stations close by. You two better come inside, wait till morning dot." My stomach dropped. There was no way I was going inside the house. I didn't know what it was, but something was telling me to leave. Now. But Claire, being polite as always, smiled again. "Oh, thank you, but I think we'll just..." "Come inside," the man said again, cutting her off. "Best not to be out here after dark." I shook my head and started to get out of the car, walking up behind Claire. "We're fine," I said. "We'll just turn around and find a place down the road." The woman's eyes narrowed at me, just for a second, before her face went blank again. "It's dark out there," she said. "You won't get far." I didn't like the way she was looking at me. I didn't like any of this. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I had the sudden urge to grab Claire and run. But before I could say anything, Roy stepped forward, closer to Claire, towering over her. "Best come inside," he said, quieter now. "Wouldn't want nothing bad happening to ya." Claire took a step back, and I saw her face change. She was scared now, too. I could see it in her eyes. But she still didn't move. I reached for her arm, pulling her gently back toward the car. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firmer this time. I wasn't asking anymore. The man didn't move. He just stared at me, his mouth twitching like he wanted to say something but was holding back. The woman didn't move either, just stood there with that same eerie stare, her eyes following us as we backed away. I turned, pulling Claire with me, and we started walking back to the car. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. We needed to get out of there, fast. Just as we reached the car, I heard the woman's voice behind us, soft but clear. "You won't make it far." I froze, my hand on the door handle. Claire was already in the passenger seat, her face pale. I looked back at the house. The man and woman were still standing there, watching us, their faces hidden in the shadows now that the sun had dipped below the horizon. I didn't respond. I just got in the car, turned the key in the ignition, and started backing down the driveway. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that they were still watching us, even as the house disappeared behind a bend in the road. "Let's just keep driving," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. We drove in silence for a few miles, the sky getting darker, the road twisting through the empty fields. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see their old truck following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty road behind us. Suddenly, the car lurched forward, and I heard a loud bang. The wheel jerked to the side, and I fought to keep control as the car swerved. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out, my heart racing. The front tire was blown. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was no way this was a coincidence. There hadn't been any debris on the road. No way I just happened to run over something sharp right after leaving that house. Claire got out of the car, her face pale. "What happened?" "Tires blown," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We must have hit something." I didn't want to scare her, but I was already thinking it, someone had done this. Maybe back at the house, maybe when we weren't looking. I opened the trunk and started pulling out the spare tire and the jack. My hands were shaking. I could feel Claire's eyes on me, but neither of us said anything. As I crouched down to start changing the tire, I heard a sound in the distance. An engine. I froze, listening. It was faint, but it was getting closer. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound was getting louder. I looked down the road and saw headlights coming toward us, cutting through the dark. My stomach dropped. It was the old truck from the farmhouse. I was on a business trip, driving for hours and exhausted by the time I pulled into the motel parking lot. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually stay, but it was late, and I was too tired to keep driving. The neon sign flickered as I parked my car, and the lot was mostly empty except for a few scattered vehicles. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small building with maybe a dozen rooms lined up side by side. The guy at the front desk seemed half asleep when I checked in. He handed me an old-fashioned key, one with a big metal keychain, not one of those electronic cards like most places use now. "Room 104. I nodded, took the key, and made my way to the room. The hallway was quiet. The carpet was stained in places, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges, but I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. The room itself wasn't bad. Clean enough. A little musty, but that's how these motels always smell. The bed was firm, the kind that makes your back ache a little, but at least it looked fresh. I tossed my bag onto the chair in the corner, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without even bothering to undress. It must have been around midnight when I finally fell asleep. I remember glancing at the old analog clock on the nightstand as I drifted off. The room was dark, just a faint light from the parking lot seeping through the thin curtains. There was a slight hum from the air conditioning unit, but it was peaceful enough. I figured I'd sleep straight through until morning. A sound woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure if it was real or just part of a dream. It was a soft click, like someone trying to open a door. I lay there for a second, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Then I heard it again, this time louder. Someone was messing with the doorknob. My first thought was that it was probably just the cleaning staff. Maybe they had the wrong room or something. But then I remembered this wasn't morning. It was still the middle of the night. I sat up, feeling a knot of fear twist in my gut. The sound came again, more deliberate now. The door rattled in its frame like someone was pushing against it. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, tiptoeing to the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the chain lock, making sure it was secure. Whoever was outside kept jiggling the handle, and now I could hear them breathing. It wasn't loud, but just enough that I knew there was someone right on the other side of the door. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" No answer. The rattling stopped, but the breathing didn't. It was so close, like they were leaning against the door, just waiting. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just another guest who'd gotten drunk and lost, or maybe the front desk had made a mistake and given someone else the same key. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed the front desk. My hands were sweating, and I could barely hold the phone steady as it rang. After a few rings, the guy finally picked up. "Front desk," he mumbled. "There's someone trying to get into my room," I whispered, pressing myself against the door as if that would somehow help. "I think they have a key. Can you come check it out?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the guy shuffling around. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "No one should have a key to your room," he said, his voice more alert now. "I didn't give anyone access." I swallowed hard. "Well, someone's out here, and they're not leaving." "I'll come down and check," he said, and I heard the sound of a chair scraping as he stood up. "Just stay inside, okay?" I nodded even though he couldn't see me, my heart pounding in my ears. The door handle rattled again, more violently this time. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on it like it might burst open at any second. I thought about calling the police, but part of me kept hoping this was just some kind of misunderstanding. A few minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I kept waiting for the front desk guy to show up, but the hallway outside stayed quiet except for the occasional shuffle of feet right outside my door. The breathing was gone, but I knew they were still there, waiting. Suddenly, the sound stopped. No more rattling, no more footsteps. Just silence. I stood frozen, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I checked my phone again, no messages, no missed calls. The front desk guy should have been here by now, right? I crept to the window, careful not to make any noise, and peeked through the crack in the curtains. The parking lot was empty, just like before. No sign of anyone. My car was still parked where I'd left it, untouched. I turned back to the door, wondering if maybe whoever was out there had given up. Maybe the front desk guy had scared them off before I even realized he'd come down. I was just about to go back to bed when I heard a knock, a soft, almost polite knock this time. "Miss, it's the front desk," came a voice. But something was off. The voice was too calm, too rehearsed. I froze. I hadn't told him I was a woman, had I? I hadn't said a word about who I was when I called. The knot in my stomach tightened. I didn't respond. The knock came again, louder this time. "Miss, it's the front desk," the voice repeated, now sounding impatient. "Open the door." I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. There was no way I was opening that door. I backed up, my hands shaking, trying to figure out what to do. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway again, heavier this time, moving toward my room. Someone else was out there. I heard murmurs, two voices now, low and muffled. They were talking to each other, planning something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my heart racing. The operator answered, and I tried to explain the situation as quietly as I could, but the words were jumbled. All I could say was that someone was trying to get into my room, that I was scared, and that I didn't know what to do. The operator told me to stay on the line, that they'd send someone over right away. The footsteps stopped. There was silence again, but I didn't trust it. I stood there, clutching the phone, my whole body shaking. Minutes passed, and then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. When the police finally arrived, the voices outside were gone. The door was still locked, the chain still in place. But when the officers searched the hallway, they found something chilling, a master key, the kind that would open any door in the motel, lying on the ground just a few feet away from my room. They never found the men who tried to get into my room that night. I was on a long drive, heading back home after visiting my folks. It was late, well after midnight. The highway was mostly empty, just me and the dark road ahead. My eyes were starting to feel heavy, so I decided to pull into a rest stop, stretch my legs, and get my mind back into focus. It was one of those small, rundown rest areas, not the kind with a lot of people. Just a couple of vending machines, a bathroom, and some benches under a flickering light. When I pulled in, there weren't any other cars around, except for one parked a little off to the side. It was an older sedan, one of those boxy models from the early 2000s. What caught my eye was the fact that both of its front doors were wide open, just hanging there, swinging slightly in the breeze. There wasn't anyone near it. No movement, no sounds. It was strange. I couldn't see inside the car from where I was parked, but I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I figured maybe someone had an emergency and left in a rush, but I didn't see any other signs of life. No one inside the small building, no lights from the vending machines, just that car with its doors wide open. I thought about getting out, just to check it out and see if maybe someone needed help, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. It felt off. You know that feeling when your gut is telling you something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it? That's what I felt. I decided not to hang around longer than I had to. I walked over to the vending machine, grabbed a soda to help keep me awake, and quickly made my way back to my car. As I unlocked the door, I took another glance at the sedan. Still empty. Still open. But now, there was something else, something in the distance. A group of people, maybe 4 or 5, standing at the edge of the rest stop. They hadn't been there when I pulled in, and I didn't hear them approach. It was like they just appeared out of nowhere. They weren't walking toward me, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me. My skin crawled, and my hands started to shake as I fumbled to get my car door open. I don't know why I was so nervous. They hadn't done anything. But something about them, the way they stood there, so still, like they were waiting for something, just sent me into a panic. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when they began to move. Slowly, all of them at once, like they had rehearsed it. They didn't run, but they didn't walk either. They just glided, almost, their steps quiet, like they didn't want to make a sound. They were heading straight for me, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I put the car in reverse, ready to back out and get the hell out of there, but I froze for a second. One of the men had split off from the group and was now standing directly behind the open sedan. He was tall, thin, and wore a jacket that looked too big for him. I could see his face now, pale, sunken eyes, but no expression. He didn't say anything, didn't make a move toward me, but just his presence there, blocking my path, was enough to keep me from going anywhere. I shifted into drive instead, hoping I could pull around and avoid him. But as soon as I turned the wheel, the others spread out, circling my car. I couldn't go forward without hitting one of them, and they knew it. They kept closing in, slow but steady, their eyes never leaving my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I tried honking the horn, hoping it would scare them off or at least make them back away, but it didn't do a thing. They didn't even flinch. They just kept coming, moving in on all sides. My breath was coming in short gasps now, panic setting in as I realized I was trapped. One of them, a woman, was closest to the passenger side. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the window, and leaned in as if she was trying to look inside. I could see her breath fogging up the glass, her eyes narrowing as she stared at me through the fog. She knocked softly, just once, with the back of her knuckles. Then she smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile, it was cold, like she knew she had me right where she wanted me. I was losing it at that point. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of there. I knew I had to do something fast, or I wasn't getting out of this rest stop. I didn't care if I hit one of them, I was getting out. I slammed the car into reverse again, gunned the engine, and backed up, barely missing the man by the sedan. He didn't move, didn't even try to get out of the way, like he didn't care if I hit him or not. As soon as I was clear of the group, I shifted into drive and floored it. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as I sped past the rest stop building and back onto the highway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't want to see if they were following me or standing there, watching me drive away. I didn't stop for another rest the entire trip home. Every time I saw a car behind me, my stomach twisted, thinking it might be them, but it never was. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, my mind replaying everything that had happened over and over again. I've never gone back to that rest stop. Hell, I don't even take that highway anymore. Whatever those people wanted, I'm just glad I didn't stick around long enough to find out. I went hiking alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. It wasn't something I normally did. I wasn't really an outdoorsy person, but the idea of getting out in the open, with just the trees, the fresh air, and no one to talk to, sounded like the perfect way to reset. I had picked this national park because it wasn't too far from the city, and the trails were supposed to be well marked. The first half of the day went fine. I packed light, just enough for a few hours' walk, then planned to head back to the car before sundown. The trail I chose wasn't particularly challenging. Mostly, I stuck to well-worn paths and checked my map app every now and then to make sure I wasn't veering too far off course. At one point, I reached a small clearing. It was quiet, except for the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, and I hadn't seen anyone else for a while. It was peaceful. Then, just as I was about to sit down for a break, I heard them before I saw them, distant engine sounds. It was weird because I didn't expect to hear vehicles that deep into the woods. I figured they must be park rangers or something, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as the noise grew louder, the unmistakable rumble of ATV engines got closer, and I started feeling uneasy. Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't explain why. Within minutes, 4 ATVs burst through the tree line, coming from the direction I had just walked. The riders were all men, maybe in their 30s or 40s. They slowed down as they reached the clearing, eyes locked on me. I was still standing there, frozen for a second, unsure if I should wave or just keep moving. One of them, a guy in a gray hoodie, pulled up right next to me, barely leaving any space between us. He had this strange grin on his face, and the rest of them stayed a few feet behind, watching me silently. "Where are you headed?" Gray Hoodie asked, his voice casual, like we were old friends or something. "Just hiking," I answered, trying to sound calm. "Heading back to my car soon." He nodded slowly but didn't move out of my way. I could feel the others staring. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, like they were waiting for me to say or do the wrong thing. "You sure you're not lost?" another one asked, this one standing behind Gray Hoodie. He had a shaved head and tattoos running up his arms. I shook my head. "No, I'm good. Thanks." I glanced at the trail behind them, realizing that they had come from the same direction I needed to go. If they decided not to leave, I wouldn't have any way of getting back without crossing paths with them again. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Better be careful," Gray Hoodie said, leaning in just a little too close. "These woods can get confusing. Easy to wander off the trail and get yourself in trouble." He smirked, and I could feel my pulse racing. I was trying to think of an excuse to get out of there, some way to slip past them without making it obvious that I was freaked out. But before I could say anything, they started revving their engines again. For a split second, I thought they were going to leave, but instead, they circled around me, their ATVs kicking up dust and leaves. I felt trapped, like a caged animal, and it took everything in me not to panic. I forced a smile. I should probably get going. Gray Hoodie nodded again, still grinning, but they didn't move to let me pass. Instead, they revved their engines again, louder this time, as if daring me to make the first move. The other men were still watching, eyes narrowed, like they were enjoying this little game they were playing. I stepped forward, hoping they'd take the hint and let me through, but they didn't. Instead, they kept circling me, blocking any path I tried to take. "Looks like you're in a hurry," Shaved Head said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Where are you off to?" I didn't answer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I needed to stay calm, but it was getting harder by the second. I didn't want to show them that I was scared, but I knew they could sense it. Suddenly, Gray Hoodie gunned his engine and peeled out ahead of me, blocking the trail completely. The others followed suit, forming a loose line in front of me. There was no way around them, and the only other option was to turn around and go deeper into the woods. I glanced behind me, weighing my options. I didn't know the area well enough to find another way out, but staying here felt like an even worse idea. "You look like you're in a hurry," Shaved Head said again, this time louder. "Maybe we could give you a ride." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "No, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just walk." Gray Hoodie leaned forward on his handlebars, eyes locked on me. "You sure about that? Could be a long walk back. You don't want to get lost." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I knew if I did, they'd follow. They were playing with me, testing how far they could push before I broke. Before I could respond, Gray Hoodie started his ATV again and slowly began creeping forward. The others did the same, closing in just enough to make it clear they weren't going to let me pass. "Let her go," a voice suddenly called out. It wasn't one of them. I turned, and standing at the edge of the clearing was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, dressed in hiking gear with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He was watching the scene unfold with a stern expression. The men on the ATVs hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other, clearly caught off guard by the newcomer. "You heard me," the older man said, stepping closer. "Let her go." Gray Hoodie scowled but didn't say anything. After a tense few seconds, he revved his engine in motion for the others to follow him. They turned their ATVs around and sped off into the woods, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. I stood there, frozen, my legs shaking. "You okay?" the older man asked, his voice calm but concerned. I nodded, still too stunned to speak. "They won't bother you again," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He paused, glancing in the direction they had gone. "Come on, I'll walk you back to the trailhead. It's not safe out here alone." I didn't argue. I followed him back to the main trail, my heart still racing, my mind trying to process what had just happened. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sun was starting to set. The older man gave me a nod and went on his way without another word. I never asked his name, and he never asked mine. I got into my car, locked the doors, and didn't look back until I was safely on the highway. Even now, I'm not sure what those men wanted, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I haven't been hiking since. I had to go to Chicago for a business trip last month. Normally, I'd stay in a hotel, but I was trying to save some money this time. So, I booked an Airbnb. The place looked nice in the photos, nothing fancy, just a quiet house on the outskirts of the city. The price was good, and the host had some decent reviews. I figured it would be fine. I arrived late that afternoon. The house looked a little more rundown than the pictures, but not too bad. It was just an old place. The host, a guy named Roger, met me at the door. He was in his early 50s, maybe, with thinning hair and a big smile. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something about the way he kept looking at me that made me uncomfortable. Like, too much eye contact. But I brushed it off. I was tired and just wanted to settle in. He gave me a tour of the house, showing me the kitchen, the bathroom, and finally the room I'd be staying in. It was a small bedroom with a double bed and an old wooden dresser. Nothing special, but clean. He pointed out the window that looked out over the backyard, mentioning how quiet it usually was in the evenings. Then, he told me if I needed anything, he lived in the basement. That seemed a little odd, having the host living right underneath, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After the tour, Roger left me alone. I unpacked, set up my laptop to get some work done, and tried to relax. The first few hours were uneventful. I ordered some takeout, watched a bit of TV, and eventually went to bed. It was around 11 when I heard the first knock on my door. I wasn't asleep yet, just lying there in the dark. The knock was soft, but it startled me. I got up, thinking maybe it was something urgent. I opened the door to see Roger standing there, still smiling. He said he wanted to check if I was settling in okay and if I needed anything before he went to bed. It felt unnecessary, but I thanked him and said I was fine. He stood there for a moment, just staring at me like he expected more conversation. I didn't give him any, and he finally turned to leave, saying goodnight. I locked the door after that. I don't know why, but something about the way he just showed up at my door made me uneasy. I lay back in bed, trying to shake off the weird feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he came back? Why had he knocked so late? The next morning, I got up early for a meeting. I didn't see Roger when I left the house, which I was relieved about. I went about my day, focusing on work, and almost forgot about the strange encounter from the night before. When I got back to the house that evening, everything seemed normal at first. I made dinner in the kitchen, ate, and then retreated to my room to unwind. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps outside my door again. I tensed up, expecting another knock, but this time there was nothing. Just the sound of footsteps lingering for a moment, then retreating down the hall. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting. My heart was pounding. I knew it had to be Roger. Who else would be walking around the house? But why didn't he knock this time? I didn't sleep much that night. Every little creak or noise from the house had me on edge. I kept thinking about how he lived in the basement. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and I wouldn't even know. The thought of him wandering around at night, possibly checking on me without my knowledge, made my skin crawl. The next day, I decided I needed to cut the trip short. I still had one more night booked, but I couldn't take the constant unease anymore. I packed up my things before heading out for my meetings and planned to leave that night, even if I had to pay for a hotel room. When I got back to the house in the evening, Roger was waiting for me in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the front door as if he knew exactly when I'd walk in. The moment I stepped inside, he stood up and smiled that same strange smile. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone almost casual, but there was something behind it that put me on edge. I hadn't told him I was planning to leave early, but maybe he saw my bags. I shrugged, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, some things came up. I have to head back tonight." His smile faded a little, and he just stood there, staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. Then, after what felt like forever, he nodded. "Well, let me know if you need anything before you go," he said, his voice quieter now. I didn't plan to give him the chance. I went straight to my room, grabbed the rest of my stuff, and started carrying it out to the car. Every time I passed the living room, he was still sitting there, watching me. Not saying anything, just watching. I made sure to lock my car doors once I had everything inside. But as I walked back to the house to drop off the key, Roger was standing in the hallway, blocking my path. He had that smile again, but this time it felt more forced. "Are you sure you don't want to stay the night?" "It's late. The roads can be dangerous at this hour," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "No, I'll be fine. Thanks, though." He didn't move, just kept standing there, staring at me. My heart was racing at this point. I didn't want to push past him, but I also didn't want to stay in that house any longer. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped aside. I handed him the key, muttered a quick goodbye, and practically ran to my car. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the driveway, watching me leave. But he wasn't there. The road was empty, and the house quickly disappeared from view. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I checked into a hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with that guy. I don't know what his deal was or what might have happened if I'd stayed longer, but I'm just glad I got out when I did. I reported the whole thing to Airbnb the next day, but I never heard anything back. When I moved into this new place, I wasn't expecting much. It's a quiet suburb, just a little outside the city. I wanted somewhere peaceful, where I wouldn't be disturbed, and this seemed perfect. Neighbors kept to themselves, and I figured I would too. But that changed fast. There's this guy who lives across the street from me. From the day I moved in, I noticed he'd always be out on his porch. He never said a word, never waved, just sat there. At first, I thought it was nothing. People like to sit outside, you know? But after a while, it started to feel strange. He was always there, no matter the time. If I went out early in the morning, there he was. If I got back late from work, same thing. He'd be sitting on his porch, facing my house, just staring. I didn't think too much of it at first. I told myself it was a coincidence. But as the days went on, I started to feel more uncomfortable. His eyes never left me, even if I just stepped out to grab the mail. It was like he was waiting for something, just watching. One night, I came home late. I had stayed out with some friends, grabbing drinks and trying to forget about how weird everything had been. It was after midnight when I pulled into my driveway. The street was quiet. No cars, no people, just the occasional streetlight buzzing. As I got out of the car, I glanced over at his house. His porch light was off, and for the first time in a while, he wasn't out there. I felt relieved. I walked up to my front door and put the key in the lock. But the moment I did, I froze. The door wasn't locked. I know for a fact that I locked it when I left. I always do. I stood there for a second, trying to convince myself that maybe I just forgot. Maybe I was in a rush when I left, or maybe I was distracted. But that uneasy feeling crept in. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The house was dark, and everything seemed normal. I walked into the living room and flipped on the light. Nothing seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake that feeling something was off. I went through the house, room by room, checking everything. The windows were all locked, nothing was missing, and nothing was broken. It didn't make sense. I stood in my kitchen for a minute, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, I noticed something small. The sliding door to my backyard was open. Just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough to set off alarms in my head. I never leave that door open. I walked over and pulled it shut, locking it. Now I was sure something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and called one of my friends, telling her what had happened. She told me to call the police, but I hesitated. I didn't know what they would say. Nothing was missing, no signs of a break-in. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I told her I'd keep an eye on things and call her if anything else happened. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises, small creaks, like footsteps, but every time I checked, nothing was there. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I tried to go about my routine. I went to work, came home, and did my best to ignore the weirdness. But when I got back that evening, he was out on his porch again, watching. This time, it was different. He wasn't just sitting there. He was standing, leaning against the railing, staring right at me as I pulled into the driveway. I didn't want to make eye contact, so I grabbed my things and hurried inside. As soon as I stepped in, I locked the door behind me. I walked through the house, double-checking every lock, making sure nothing was out of place. Everything seemed fine, but that feeling wouldn't go away. I was sitting on my couch, trying to distract myself with the TV, when I heard it. A soft knock at the door. It was so quiet, I almost didn't notice it at first. But then it came again, just a little louder. I stood up, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone approach the house, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Maybe it was kids playing a prank or something. But as I turned to walk away, the knock came again, this time louder. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. I looked through the peephole again, and again, no one was there. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, trying to listen. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around outside. I backed away from the door, grabbing my phone. I called my friend again, telling her what was happening. She told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and call the police. I hesitated, not sure if it was serious enough to get them involved, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the sliding door in the back opening. I didn't even think. I ran to the back of the house, grabbing the first thing I could find, a kitchen knife. I stood there, my heart pounding, listening to the door creak open. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was there. I could feel it. I dialed 911, whispering to the operator what was happening. They told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. But every second felt like an eternity. I didn't hear footsteps, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Someone was inside my house. I backed up slowly, moving toward the front door, still clutching the knife. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to confront whoever it was, but I didn't want to wait around either. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I unlocked it and pulled it open. The moment I stepped outside, I ran. I didn't even look back. I ran across the street, not caring if anyone saw me. I ran until I reached the end of the block, where I could see the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers came and searched the house. They didn't find anyone, but the sliding door had been tampered with, and there were muddy footprints leading through the backyard. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye on things. I stayed at a friend's place for a while after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, even when I wasn't at home. Every time I went back to the house, I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. And every time I looked across the street, he was there, sitting on his porch, watching me. It was late. I remember that clearly. I'd been driving for hours, trying to get home from a work trip. The highway was empty, the kind of empty that feels unnatural, like you're the last person on Earth. There wasn't much around, just stretches of road cutting through dark fields, an occasional patch of trees, and nothing but stars above. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the hum of my engine and the whistling wind through the cracked window. At first, I didn't think much of it when I noticed the headlights behind me. It was just another car, probably someone else on a long drive, just like me. But as the miles rolled on, those headlights stayed close. Too close. I slowed down a bit, hoping they'd pass. But they didn't. They just hung back, staying the same distance behind, like they were matching my speed. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were nervous about driving in the dark, or maybe they were tired and following me for comfort. I didn't think about it too hard. But then I sped up. Not a lot, just a little, to see what they'd do. They sped up too. That's when the knot formed in my stomach. Something was off. I kept driving, trying not to let it bother me. Maybe I was being paranoid. But every time I sped up, they sped up. Every time I slowed down, they slowed down. It wasn't just a coincidence. They were following me. And we were in the middle of nowhere. I felt the sweat start to prick at the back of my neck. The highway stretched ahead of me, a never-ending line through the dark, and that car, it was still there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe they were going the same way. Maybe this was all in my head. But deep down, I knew. I knew something wasn't right. I kept driving, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles were white. The tension in my chest was growing with each mile. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to make out the car, but all I could see were the bright headlights, glaring and blinding. There was no way to see the driver, no way to know who was behind the wheel. I needed to get off the highway, to lose them. I wasn't going to keep playing this game. The next exit was miles away, though, and there was nothing but flat land and empty fields on either side of me. I saw a turnoff coming up a dirt road that led off the highway. Without thinking, I took it, jerking the wheel and turning sharply. Gravel kicked up under the tires, and for a second, I thought I'd lost them. But then I saw it. Those damn headlights. They followed me onto the dirt road. I started to panic. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. They were following me. I couldn't explain why or who, but I knew they were after me. I could feel it. I pressed my foot down on the gas, the car bouncing over the uneven road. The dirt kicked up in a cloud behind me, but when I looked in the mirror, they were still there. That same distance, those same blinding lights. Always right behind me. I didn't know where the road led. I just knew I needed to keep going. But the further I drove, the worse the road got. It wasn't even a road anymore, just a trail through the fields. My car wasn't made for this, and I could feel it struggling to keep up, the tires slipping in the dirt, the suspension groaning under the rough terrain. And still, that car followed. I needed to do something. I couldn't just keep driving until I ran out of gas, which wouldn't be long at the rate I was going. There wasn't a gas station for miles, no town, no buildings. Just fields and trees. That's when I made a decision. I slammed on the brakes. My car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the dirt. I threw the car into park and jumped out, my heart pounding in my ears. I was done running. I was going to face whoever it was, no matter what. The car behind me stopped too. The headlights stayed on, blinding me. I couldn't see a thing beyond them. My chest was tight, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. I stood there, waiting for something to happen. For the driver to get out, to say something, to explain what the hell they were doing. But nothing happened. The car just sat there, engine idling, lights glaring. I shouted, something angry, something desperate, but there was no response. Just a low rumble of the engine. I walked closer, my hands shaking, trying to shield my eyes from the light. As I got nearer, I could feel my legs getting weak, like they might give out any second. But I wasn't going to back down. I was going to see who it was, who was following me, who was tormenting me on this empty road in the middle of nowhere. I was only a few feet from the car when the engine roared to life. I barely had time to react before the tires screeched, and the car peeled out, speeding past me, the wind whipping in my face as it shot down the dirt road, kicking up dust and rocks in its wake. I stood there, frozen, watching as the car disappeared into the night, the taillights shrinking until there were just two red dots in the distance. And then they were gone. I stumbled back to my car, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with questions. Who were they? Why were they following me? Why didn't they do anything? I sat there for a long time, just staring down the road where they vanished. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get back on the highway. I didn't want to keep driving, but I couldn't stay there. Eventually, I turned the car around and headed back to the main road. The headlights weren't there anymore. The road was empty, just like it had been before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere, watching me. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my hands trembling on the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see those headlights again, but the fear stayed with me. Even now, when I drive at night, I can't help but look behind me, expecting to see those lights, following me, waiting for me to stop again. I was driving back from visiting my sister. It was late, later than I had planned to be out on the road, but I wanted to make it home that night, so I pushed through. The highway was empty, dark. I had hours left to drive and my gas was running low. I started scanning the sides of the road for a gas station, knowing I hadn't seen one in a while. Finally, after what felt like forever, I spotted the glowing lights of a station up ahead. It was one of those old, isolated places, just a single building with a couple of pumps out front. The neon sign flickered, barely working, but it was the only option, and I didn't have much choice. I pulled off the highway, the gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop near the pumps. The station looked empty, no other cars around. I got out, feeling the cold night air hit me, and I tried to swipe my card at the pump. The screen flashed an error, telling me to see the attendant inside. Great. I didn't really want to go in, but I needed gas. I walked toward the door, feeling uneasy but trying to shake it off. It was just a rundown gas station, nothing weird about that. When I stepped inside, the bell above the door rang, echoing in the quiet store. It was dimly lit, the kind of place that smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. Shelves were stocked with dusty snacks and cheap souvenirs that probably hadn't been touched in years. The attendant was standing behind the counter, staring at me as soon as I walked in. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and a wrinkled face. He didn't smile, didn't say anything right away. Just watched me with these blank, heavy eyes. "Ah, the pump isn't working," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Can I pay inside?" He nodded slowly, like it took effort to move his head. His eyes stayed fixed on me the whole time, never blinking. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was late, and he was probably just tired. "How much?" he asked, his voice low, almost a mumble. "Ah, 40 should do it," I said, pulling out my card. He didn't reach for it. Just kept staring. "You're traveling alone?" he asked, his voice still that same monotone. I froze for a second, not sure why he'd ask that. I forced a smile, trying to act like it wasn't weird. "Yeah, just passing through." He didn't respond. Just swiped my card, handed it back to me, and still kept watching. My skin started to crawl, and I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. "Pump's ready," he finally said, but he didn't move from behind the counter. I nodded, backing up toward the door. Something about the way he was staring at me made me feel like I needed to get out of there. I reached for the door handle, but when I pulled, it didn't budge. I pulled again, harder, but it was locked. I turned around to see the attendant still standing there, staring at me, his hand now resting on the counter, like he was waiting for me to notice something. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking now. He didn't answer. His hand slid slowly across the counter and I saw what he had under it, a key, dangling from his fingers. My heart started pounding in my chest. I could feel the panic rising, but I tried to stay calm. "Open the door," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice was trembling. He didn't move. Just kept holding the key, swinging it back and forth like he was toying with me. The silence in the store was suffocating, just the hum of the old lights above and my own breathing filling the air. "Please," I said, my voice cracking now. "Just let me out." He stepped out from behind the counter, still holding the key. He wasn't in any hurry, just taking slow, deliberate steps toward me. I backed up until I hit the door, my hand still gripping the handle even though I knew it wouldn't open. "You're alone," he said again, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Ain't nobody out there." I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my pocket, but I knew there was no way I could call anyone before he got to me. He was only a few feet away now, still moving slowly, like he had all the time in the world. "I just want to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes still locked on mine. For a second, I thought maybe he was going to let me go, that maybe this was just some kind of sick joke. But then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, a cold, dead smile that made my stomach turn. He lifted the key, twirling it in his fingers like he was thinking about it, like he was enjoying watching me squirm. "Why don't you stay a while?" he said, his voice still that same low mumble. "It's quiet out here. No one would hear you if you screamed." I felt the blood drain from my face. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't let him see how scared I was, even though I knew he already did. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Open the door." He didn't move. Just stood there, still smiling, still holding the key just out of reach. And then, in one desperate move, I lunged at him. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed for the key, my fingers brushing against his hand, but he was faster. He yanked it back, and before I knew it, his hand was on my wrist, gripping it so tightly it hurt. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes, and I knew in that moment that I had to fight, or I wasn't getting out of there. With my free hand, I swung at him, hitting him in the side of the head. It wasn't a strong hit, but it was enough to make him let go of my wrist. I stumbled back, and he lunged at me, but I ducked out of the way, grabbing the first thing I could find off one of the shelves, a heavy can of something, and I threw it at him. He grunted as it hit his shoulder, but it didn't slow him down. He came at me again, faster this time, and I barely had time to move out of the way. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps as I realized I didn't have much time. I ran for the back of the store, hoping there was another way out. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy on the floor. I reached the back door, but it was locked too. Of course it was. I spun around just as he caught up to me, his hand reaching for me again. I kicked out, hitting him in the knee, and he stumbled, giving me just enough time to grab a nearby shelf and shove it toward him. It didn't knock him down, but it slowed him enough for me to dart around him and run back toward the front of the store. The door. The key. I had to get it. I grabbed another can from a shelf and threw it at him, aiming for his head this time. It hit him square in the face, and he let out a yell of pain, clutching his nose. Blood started dripping down his face, but he didn't stop. He was like a machine, just focused on me, coming after me no matter what. I reached the counter and grabbed the key where he dropped it when I hit him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock, but I finally did. The door clicked open, and I ran out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I got to my car. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys, but I finally got the door open and jumped inside. I locked the doors just as I saw him stumble out of the store, his face twisted in anger, blood still dripping from his nose. I didn't wait. I started the car and sped out of there, my heart racing, my whole body shaking. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him following me, but he didn't. He just stood there in the parking lot, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the road, until I felt like I was far enough away that he couldn't catch up to me. Even then, I couldn't stop shaking. I don't know what he wanted, what he would have done if I hadn't gotten away. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never stopping at a gas station in the middle of nowhere again. It was late. Later than I'd planned to be out. I'd finished work later than usual, and by the time I got to the station, I'd missed the last train home. The platform was empty, dead silent except for the occasional hum of the wind. The next train wasn't for hours. I checked my phone 1:30 a.m. No missed calls, no texts. The signal was bad down here, but I wasn't expecting anyone to check in on me anyway. I sat on a cold metal bench, arms wrapped around myself for warmth. It wasn't freezing, but there was a damp chill in the air. The platform lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty station. It wasn't the best part of town, either. I thought about calling a cab, but the prices this late would be ridiculous, and I was trying to save money. I figured I'd just wait it out. I didn't have many options. As I sat there, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They echoed off the walls of the station, getting louder as they got closer. I looked up, and a man was walking toward me. He wasn't in a rush, just strolling along like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look out of place at first. Maybe in his mid-40s, a bit scruffy, like he'd been out drinking or just didn't care about his appearance. He wore a dark jacket that looked a bit too big for him, and his jeans were worn, frayed at the ends. His hair was messy, uncombed, and he had this stubble on his face that made him look like he hadn't shaved in days. I glanced down at my phone, hoping he wouldn't try to talk to me. I didn't want to engage with anyone at this hour, especially not here, not alone. "Missed the train?" he asked, his voice low but carrying through the empty station. I nodded, not making eye contact, just hoping that would be enough to get him to move on. But he didn't. He stopped a few feet from where I was sitting, his eyes on me. "Not many people around at this time," he said, like he was just making conversation. "Quiet, isn't it?" "Yeah," I muttered, still looking at my phone, pretending to be engrossed in whatever was on the screen. But I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel the way he was watching me, like he was waiting for something. "You live around here?" he asked, taking a step closer. His voice had this edge to it now, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my skin crawl. I shook my head, just waiting for the next train. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that felt wrong, like he was thinking something he wasn't saying. "You're out here all alone?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. It sounded almost curious. I tensed up, trying not to show how uncomfortable I was. "I'm fine. I'm just waiting for the train." He nodded, but he didn't move away. Instead, he took another step closer, his eyes never leaving me. "You shouldn't be out here by yourself," he said, his voice quieter now, almost like a whisper. "It's not safe." I swallowed hard, feeling my heart rate pick up. Something about the way he said that made my stomach churn. I looked up at him finally, and his eyes were locked on mine, too intense, too focused. "I'll be fine," I said, my voice a bit shaky now. I'm just waiting for the next train." He smiled again, that same unsettling smile, and then he sat down on the bench next to me. Not directly next to me, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air, feel his presence too close for comfort. "I've seen you around before," he said, his voice soft but persistent. "You take the train a lot, don't you?" I froze. I had never seen this man before in my life. And I took the train regularly, but not at this time, and never from this station. "No, I don't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You must have me confused with someone else." He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. "No, I've seen you before. You've got one of those faces, you know? Hard to forget." My heart was racing now. I glanced around the platform, but it was still empty. No one else was coming. No train, no other passengers. Just me and him. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his voice taking on this mocking tone. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The way he said it made it sound like a lie. Like he wanted me to believe it, but he didn't mean it. "I'm not scared," I said, even though my voice betrayed me. I was scared. Terrified, actually. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there, to run, but there was nowhere to go. No way off the platform until the next train came. "You shouldn't lie," he said, leaning in just a little closer. "I can tell when someone's lying." I stood up, my legs shaky, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I walked toward the far end of the platform, hoping he wouldn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, just like before. "Where you going?" he called out, his voice teasing now. "There's nowhere to go." I ignored him, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to stay calm. I needed to figure out what to do. I couldn't run, there was nowhere to run to. But I couldn't just stand there and let him corner me. I stopped near the edge of the platform, turning to face him. He was still walking toward me, that same unsettling smile on his face. He wasn't in any rush. He was taking his time, enjoying this, enjoying watching me panic. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice louder now, more forceful. "I don't want to talk to you." His smile faded, just for a second, and something darker flashed in his eyes. Then he took another step toward me. "Come on," he said, his voice low again. "I'm just trying to be friendly." I said, "Leave me alone." I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty walls of the station. He stopped, his expression hardening. For a moment, I thought maybe he was going to turn and walk away. But then he took another step forward, faster this time, closing the distance between us. I stepped back, my foot hitting the edge of the platform. I was too close to the tracks now. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, choking me, but I couldn't let him see that. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." He laughed then, this low, menacing laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You're already in trouble," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "You just don't know it yet." My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one around. No help. No way out. Then I heard it. The faint sound of a train in the distance. It was coming. It wasn't close yet, but it was coming. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm getting on that train, and you're going to leave me alone." He tilted his head, like he was considering what I'd said. Then he smiled again, that same cold, dead smile, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out toward me. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped back again, but there was nowhere left to go. I could hear the train now, getting closer, but it wasn't fast enough. He was almost on me now, his hand inches from my arm, and I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, my voice echoing through the station. He froze, his hand dropping to his side, his eyes wide with surprise. And then, the train's headlights appeared, bright and blinding, and I ran. I ran toward the doors as they opened, throwing myself inside just as they started to close. I didn't look back. I didn't see if he followed me. I just sat down, shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, and waited for the train to pull away. As it did, I glanced out the window. He was still standing on the platform, staring at me, that same smile on his face. But he didn't move. He just watched as the train disappeared into the night. I never took that train line again. I was driving back from a weekend camping trip, way out in the sticks. I didn't see a lot of people out there, but I liked that. I'd been going to the same spot for a few years whenever I needed to clear my head. It was peaceful. Just me, my gear, and a couple days away from everything. I was about 2 hours from home when my car started acting up. It wasn't like anything obvious at first. Just little stutters, like the engine was choking on something. Then, all of a sudden, it just gave up. The engine died, and I had to pull over to the side of the road. I tried starting it again. Nothing. It wasn't even trying to turn over. I was in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no gas stations, nothing around. Just miles of road and trees on either side. I got out and popped the hood, even though I didn't really know what I was looking for. I'm not a mechanic. The engine looked fine, but something was obviously wrong. I checked my phone. Of course, no service. Not even one bar. I was standing there, thinking about whether I should start walking or wait and hope someone drove by, when I heard a car coming from behind me. I turned around, and this beat-up old truck came rolling down the road. The guy driving it slowed down as he got close, then pulled over a little ahead of me. He got out of the truck and started walking over. He looked like he was in his mid-50s, maybe a little older. He was wearing a baseball cap, dirty jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He had this big, friendly smile on his face. "You need some help?" he asked, nodding at my car. "Yeah," I said, "thing just died on me. I'm not sure what's wrong." He walked up to the car and took a quick look under the hood. He didn't seem to really inspect anything, just glanced around like he was thinking it over. "Could be a lot of things," he said, scratching his chin. "You ain't gonna get it going out here, though. Nearest mechanic's in town, but that's a good 20 miles from here." I figured as much. I had a spare tire, a few tools, but nothing that would fix an engine. I didn't even know if it was the engine. It could have been something electrical for all I knew. "I can give you a lift," he offered. "Town ain't too far, and I'm headed that way anyway. You can get someone out here with a tow truck." I hesitated. There was something about being out here in the middle of nowhere and just jumping into a stranger's truck that didn't sit right with me. But it wasn't like I had a lot of options. It was either take the ride or walk who knows how many miles before I got a signal. "Yeah," I said after a moment, "that'd be great." "Thanks." He grinned and slapped me on the back. "No problem, buddy. Hop in." I grabbed my backpack out of the car, just the essentials: wallet, phone, keys, and locked up. I figured I'd deal with the rest once I got to town. I got into the passenger seat of his truck, which smelled like a mix of old tobacco and motor oil. He had a bunch of junk scattered across the dashboard, empty soda cans, a couple tools, and some random papers. The seats were worn, the fabric torn in a few places. It was the kind of truck that looked like it had been around for a while, but still had some life in it. He climbed into the driver's seat, started up the engine, and we pulled back onto the road. For the first few miles, we just made small talk. He asked where I was coming from, what I did for work, stuff like that. He seemed nice enough, just a chatty local who liked talking to people. I told him about the camping trip, and he nodded along like he knew the area. Yeah, lots of folks like to camp out that way, he said. Quiet, good place to get away from things. I relaxed a little, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid before. This guy was just trying to help out, and I was overthinking it. But then the conversation shifted. You ever hear about the folks that go missing out here? He asked, his voice casual, like he was talking about the weather. I glanced at him, confused. Missing? Yeah, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. Happens every once in a while. Someone goes out hiking or camping, doesn't come back. They usually find their stuff, but not them. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if he was just trying to make conversation, or if he was messing with me. Either way, it didn't sit right. Yeah, well, that happens, I guess, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. People get lost. He chuckled. Oh, they don't get lost. Not all of them, anyway. Some of them just disappear. Like they never existed. I didn't know what to say to that. There was something in the way he said it, something that made me feel like he wasn't just talking. Like he knew something. The road stretched out ahead of us, long and empty, with no signs of town anywhere. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. We'd been driving for at least 15 minutes, and there was still no sign of civilization. How far did you say the town was? I asked, trying to sound casual. Not much farther, he said, but there was a strange tone in his voice now. Just a few more miles. I nodded, but I was starting to get a bad feeling. Something about the way he was talking, the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, made me uneasy. So, what do you do out here? I asked, trying to change the subject. You live around here? Yeah, he said. Lived here my whole life. Know these woods like the back of my hand. He glanced at me again, and I could feel his eyes lingering on me for a second too long. Not many people come through here anymore, he continued. Used to be a lot busier. Now it's mostly folks like you, passing through, looking for a little adventure. I nodded, not really sure what to say. I kept looking out the window, hoping to see something, anything that looked like a town. But all I saw were trees. Endless trees. I was starting to feel trapped. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to stay calm, but the longer we drove, the more I realized we weren't heading anywhere near a town. I think we should have passed it by now, I said, my voice a little shaky. Maybe we missed a turn? He didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, staring straight ahead. No, we didn't miss anything, he said finally, his voice cold now. We're going exactly where we need to go. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right. I didn't know where we were going, but it wasn't anywhere I wanted to be. I think I'll just walk from here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Thanks for the ride, but I'll figure it out. He didn't slow down. He didn't even look at me. You can't walk from here. It's too far. My heart was racing now. I was trapped in this truck with a stranger who wasn't taking me where he said he would. and I had no idea what to do. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just pull over, and I'll walk." He glanced at me, and there was something in his eyes that terrified me. Something dark, something dangerous. "You're not walking anywhere," he said, his voice low. "You're staying right where you are." I felt panic rising in my chest. I looked at the door handle, wondering if I could open it, if I could jump out, but we were going too fast. I'd break something, or worse, if I tried. "Look, I don't know what this is, but I'm getting out," I said, my voice trembling now. "Pull over." He didn't answer. He just kept driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter now. I reached for the door handle, ready to take my chances, but before I could open it, he swerved the truck, slamming me against the door. My head hit the window, and stars exploded in my vision. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his voice full of menace now. "You should have stayed in your car." I was panicking now, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was I had to get out of that truck. The road ahead curved sharply, and as he took the turn, I saw a dirt path leading off the main road. It was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and trees, but he was heading right for it. I didn't have much time. I had to act now, or I wouldn't get another chance. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, throwing myself out of the truck just as he swerved onto the dirt path. I hit the ground hard, rolling and tumbling down the side of the road, my body slamming into rocks and dirt. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, running as fast as I could toward the woods. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my heart pounding, my legs burning, branches scratching at my face and arms. I ran until I couldn't hear him anymore, until the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. Eventually, I found my way back to the road. I flagged down the first car I saw and called the police. They never found him, but I know he's still out there. We'd been on the road for about 6 hours, just me and Emily. It was one of those spontaneous trips we decided to take after months of talking about it. No real destination in mind, just heading west, stopping when we felt like it, trying to enjoy some time away from work and everything else. We rented an RV for the week and figured we'd just see where we ended up. Around late afternoon, we started feeling the need to stop for the night. I was tired of driving, and Emily looked like she could use a break from sitting, too. The GPS wasn't much help, but we came across this small RV park that seemed decent enough. It wasn't one of those big places with all the amenities or anything, just a little spot off the highway with maybe a dozen other RVs scattered around. We pulled in, found a spot near the back, and parked. The place had this odd stillness to it, like no one was really around, even though I could see a couple of people outside their RVs, sitting in lawn chairs or walking around. It wasn't eerie, exactly, but there was something strange about it. I couldn't put my finger on it. Emily got out to stretch, and I did the same, walking around the RV and checking things over. As I came around to the front, this guy came out of the RV next to us. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing a faded t-shirt and cargo shorts, and he had this wide smile plastered on his face. The kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey there, neighbors," he said, walking toward us with his hand extended. "You just giving in for the night?" "Yeah," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was tight, almost too tight. "Just passing through." Nice, he said, still smiling. "Name's Paul. My wife and I have been here for about a week now. It's a good spot. Quiet. Friendly folks, too. Emily smiled politely from where she stood by the door of our RV. That's nice. We're just stopping overnight, I think. Paul nodded, his eyes darting from me to Emily and then back again, like he was sizing us up. Well, if you need anything, we're right next door. Don't be strangers. He stood there for a second longer than felt normal, just watching us, that smile still glued to his face. Then, finally, he turned and walked back toward his RV. That was weird, Emily whispered as we climbed into the RV. Yeah, I agreed, trying to brush it off. Just trying to be friendly, I guess. We spent the next hour or so settling in, making a quick dinner, and going over the map to figure out where we'd head the next day. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see Paul standing there, grinning at us through the glass. But he wasn't. A little after dusk, another couple knocked on the door. They looked to be in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, and they seemed just as eager to introduce themselves as Paul had been. The woman, Taryn, talked a lot, asking where we were from, where we were headed, how long we'd been on the road. She laughed a little too hard at every joke we made, and her husband, Mike, kept nodding along like everything was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. It wasn't just small talk, though. They asked questions that felt off. Like how much money we spent on gas, what kind of work we did, if anyone else knew we were on this trip. Emily and I tried to answer casually, but something about the way they were looking at us, like they were waiting for specific answers, made me uncomfortable. Eventually, they left, saying they'd be up for a while if we wanted to come over and hang out by their fire. We smiled and nodded, but the second they were gone, Emily locked the door. I don't like this place, she said, her voice low. Something feels wrong. I couldn't argue with her. The way Paul, Taryn, and Mike acted, like they were being overly friendly but in a way that felt forced, rehearsed almost, it just didn't sit right with me. I told Emily we'd leave first thing in the morning. Get out early and find somewhere else to stop. Somewhere that didn't make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That night, after we climbed into bed, I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe some animals. But after a while, I started to hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around the RV, trying to stay quiet. Emily was already asleep, and I didn't want to wake her, but I sat up and listened harder, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps circled the RV, stopping every now and then, like whoever it was checking something. I could hear faint whispering, too, like more than one person was out there, talking under their breath. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and went to the front of the RV. I peeked out one of the small windows, but it was too dark to see much. I couldn't tell who, if anyone, was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, figuring I could at least scare them off or call someone if things got weird. I was about to open the door when Emily stirred. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice groggy. "I think someone's outside," I whispered. "Just stay here. I'm going to check." She sat up, looking scared. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just one of those animals we heard earlier." "No, this is different," I said. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the RV. I didn't see anyone at first, but I could still hear those faint whispers, like they were coming from just beyond the circle of light. I walked around the RV, scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, coming from the direction of Paul's RV. I swung the flashlight around, and there he was, standing at the edge of the light, smiling that same unnerving smile. "Everything okay, neighbor?" he asked, his voice too calm. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Paul took a step closer, his eyes glinting in the beam of the flashlight. This place can play tricks on you at night. Lots of animals around. He took another step, and I noticed something in his hand, a small tool, maybe a wrench or a tire iron. I backed up, keeping the light on him. I think we're good for the night, I said, my heart racing. Thanks, though. Paul's smile never wavered. You sure? We're all neighbors here. Gotta look out for each other. I didn't respond. I just backed toward the RV, my hand on the door handle. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, that tool still in his hand. I got back inside, locked the door, and pulled the blind shut. Emily was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed. What happened? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking. But we're leaving. Right now. We threw on some clothes, packed up what we could in a hurry, and got the RV ready to go. As I started the engine, I glanced out the window. Paul was still standing there, watching us. And a little ways behind him, I could see Karen and Mike, standing in the shadows, just staring. I didn't waste any time. I pulled out of the spot and headed straight for the exit. As we passed the other RVs, I saw more people standing outside, watching us. Silent. No one waved, no one called out. Just stared. We didn't stop driving until we hit the next town, miles away. I've never felt so relieved to see other cars and streetlights in my life. I don't know what those people wanted, or why they were acting like that. But whatever it was, I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out. It started with a phone call. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when my apartment's intercom buzzed. I got up, expecting it to be a package or maybe someone from the building, but instead, it was just a regular phone call. Unknown number. I normally don't answer those, but something made me pick it up this time. Hello? I said, half distracted. The voice on the other end was deep, calm. Hi, this is Mark, your building manager. We've got an issue with the water pipes in your unit. I need to come up and check things out, make sure everything's in working order. I froze for a second. I'd never met the building manager before. I'd only been living here for a few months, and everything had been smooth. No leaks, no problems with water. But then again, it wasn't out of the ordinary for maintenance to stop by unannounced in older buildings like this. Oh, I said. I didn't notice anything wrong. It's a precaution, he said quickly. Just a routine check. Something in his voice seemed off. It was too casual, like he was trying too hard to sound normal. But I brushed it off. I figured I was just being paranoid. Living alone, you get that way sometimes. Okay, sure. When do you need to come by? 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. I'm already in the building. That felt strange. I hadn't heard anyone in the hall, and the way he said it, it was like he was already near my door. I walked over and looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. All right, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll be here. I hung up and immediately regretted it. Something wasn't sitting right with me, so I pulled up the building's management number and called, just to make sure it was legit. The office was closed, though, and no one answered. Great. I paced around the apartment, checking the faucets, the shower, even flushing the toilet, trying to see if there was anything wrong with the pipes. Everything worked fine. No leaks, no strange noises, nothing. A few minutes passed, and I heard a knock at the door. 3 sharp, quick knocks. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't sure why I was so nervous all of a sudden. I walked up to the door and looked through the peephole again. There was a man standing there. Tall, wearing a dark jacket. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he was looking down at the floor, shuffling his feet a little. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something about his posture made me uneasy. He wasn't standing like someone from maintenance would, you know? It didn't look professional, it looked casual. Too casual. I didn't open the door right away. I stood there, watching him through the peephole, my breath shallow. He knocked again, louder this time, and I jumped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "It's Mark, the building manager," the man said, his voice muffled through the door. "I'm here to check the pipes, like I mentioned on the phone." I didn't move. I kept staring at him, trying to make a decision. Something felt very wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy wasn't who he said he was. "Can you show me some ID?" I asked, hoping that would settle things. If he was legit, he'd have no problem with that, right? There was a long pause. Too long. I don't have it on me right now," he said, sounding irritated. "But I'm with the building, like I told you." That was it for me. I backed away from the door slowly, keeping my eye on the peephole. My hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound calm, "but I'm going to need to call the office to confirm." "Look, lady," he snapped, his voice completely different now, harsher, angry. "I'm just trying to do my job. Open the door." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. I grabbed my phone and started dialing the non-emergency police line, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As the phone rang, I looked through the peephole again. He was still there, but now he was staring directly at the door, his face twisted in frustration. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. "Open the door," he said again, this time barely more than a whisper. He leaned in closer, his face inches from the door, and I could hear his breathing through the crack at the bottom. The phone kept ringing, and no one was picking up. I was starting to panic. "I'm calling the police," I finally shouted, hoping that would scare him off. For a second, it seemed to work. He stepped back, staring at the door. Then, he turned and walked down the hall, out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I kept the phone to my ear, waiting for someone to answer. I didn't hear footsteps after he left. No sound of the elevator, no doors opening or closing. I stayed by the door, watching the peephole, waiting for something, anything. But there was just silence. After what felt like an eternity, the call finally connected. I explained everything to the operator as calmly as I could, though my voice was shaking, and they told me they'd send someone to check the building. I thanked them, hung up, and stood there in the middle of my apartment, unsure of what to do next. I didn't dare open the door. I waited, every second feeling like it stretched on forever. I heard nothing from the hallway, no footsteps, no voices. Just silence. Maybe 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but I thought it might be the police. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, then the same voice from earlier, low and cold. "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, my blood running cold. I hung up immediately, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I ran to the door, made sure it was locked, then checked all the windows. Everything was secure, but I didn't feel safe. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was loud and urgent. I jumped, my heart racing again. I checked the peephole, and to my relief, it was a police officer, uniform and all. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see his face. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his tone calm but serious. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. Someone was here. He said he was the building manager, but he wasn't. He called me after he left. The officer's face darkened. "We've checked the building, and there's no one matching the description you gave us. But we'll stay on patrol for the night, just in case." I thanked him, feeling a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. After he left, I locked the door again, triple-checking it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't gone far, that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every distant sound made my heart race, and I kept checking the peephole, expecting to see him standing there again. But the hallway stayed empty. The next day, I called the actual building manager and told him everything. He confirmed what I already knew. There was no one named Mark working for the building. No one had been sent to check on my apartment. I still don't know who that man was, or what he really wanted. But I haven't felt safe in my apartment since. I moved a few weeks later, and I haven't heard from him again. But sometimes, when I'm home alone, I swear I can still hear those 3 sharp knocks echoing in my head. I was driving back from a weekend trip up in the mountains, taking the old forest road I'd always used to avoid the main highway. It was quieter, mostly empty, and cut about half an hour off my drive. I'd done it dozens of times, knew the turns and stretches where there were no houses, no gas stations, just trees on either side. The kind of place that gets pitch black at night with no streetlights. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the road. I'd been driving for a while and hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. I had my music playing low, one hand on the wheel, when I saw a car up ahead pulled off to the side of the road. It looked like an old sedan, beat up, kind of dirty. The hood was popped open, and there was a guy standing next to it, looking down at the engine. At first, I wasn't going to stop. I mean, you hear stories, right? But then I thought, what if it was me? I'd want someone to stop. Maybe it was just a guy with car trouble, and I'd feel like an asshole if I kept driving and left him stranded. So, I slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of him. I glanced in my rearview mirror as I put the car in park. The guy was still there, but I hadn't noticed before there was another person, a woman, standing on the passenger side of the car. She was leaning against the door, arms crossed, just staring at me. It felt weird immediately. There was something about how still she was, just watching, not even talking to the guy. I took a deep breath, telling myself not to be paranoid. I cracked my window and leaned out a bit. "Hey, everything all right?" I called out. The guy straightened up and turned toward me. He was tall, a little scruffy, wearing a jacket that looked too big for him. He didn't answer right away, just stared for a second, then started walking over to my car. That's when my gut started telling me something was off. He wasn't waving, wasn't smiling, just walking slowly, almost deliberately. I glanced at the woman again. She hadn't moved an inch. The guy stopped a couple of feet from my window. "Yeah, car broke down," he said, his voice flat, like he wasn't even bothered by it. "Think it's the engine or something." I looked past him at the car. You need a jump? I've got cables in the trunk. He shook his head, not looking at me now, just staring down at the ground. Nah, it's not that. But maybe you could come take a look. I'm not really sure what's wrong. I didn't like that. Not at all. I mean, I don't know much about cars, but even I could tell that didn't make sense. If he didn't know what was wrong, how'd he know it wasn't the battery? And why wasn't he calling for help? I glanced at my phone, which was sitting in the cup holder. No signal. Of course. We were in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was probably a good 40 minutes away. I looked back up at the guy. He wasn't moving, just standing there, waiting for me to say something. The woman still hadn't moved. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to get out, just to take a look and be done with it. But the other part, the louder part, was screaming at me to leave. I don't know, man, I said slowly, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I don't think I'd be much help. You should probably call a tow truck. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at me now. The silence was heavy. I could feel my heart beating faster, and I had this sudden urge to just drive. Just put the car in gear and get the hell out of there. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was slow, like he was figuring something out. Yeah, he said, almost to himself. Yeah, you're probably right. He turned and started walking back to his car, but as he did, I saw something in my side mirror. Movement. From the trees. I whipped my head around, and that's when I saw two more people stepping out of the woods on the other side of the road. Two men, both wearing dark jackets like the first guy. They weren't rushing, just walking toward the road, like they'd been waiting there, hiding. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a couple with car trouble. This was something else. The guy had reached his car now, but instead of going back to the hood, he opened the driver's door and leaned in, like he was grabbing something. My hands were shaking. I put the car into gear, ready to take off, but then I heard it. A soft tap on the passenger side window. I turned my head slowly, and there she was. The woman, now right up against my car, her face inches from the glass, her hand resting lightly on the window. She wasn't smiling, wasn't saying anything, just looking at me with these cold, empty eyes. I hadn't even seen her move. 1 second she was leaning against the car, and now she was right there. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. If I tried to drive off, she was close enough that I'd hit her. But the guys were getting closer. I could see them in my mirror, walking right toward my car. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to go, to just floor it, but my body wouldn't move. I could hear my own breathing, loud and fast, and then the woman spoke, her voice soft but sharp. You should get out of the car, she said. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Get out of the car, she repeated, more forceful this time. Her hand was still on the window, tapping now, like she was impatient. The guys were almost at my door. I could see one of them smiling now, that same slow, twisted smile the first guy had given me. They were going to surround me. They were going to trap me. Something snapped inside me then. Pure instinct. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires squealed, and for a split second, I thought I wasn't going to move. But then the car lurched forward, and I was off, speeding down the road, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw the guy jump back from the road, and the woman's hand slid off the window as I tore away. The other two men stopped in their tracks, just standing there in the middle of the road, watching me go. I kept driving, not daring to slow down, not looking back again. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know what they would have done if I'd gotten out of the car. But I know one thing, I'm never taking that road again. When I finally got to a town with cell service, I pulled over and called the cops. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I never heard back. I don't know if they found anything. I don't think I want to know. I had been looking forward to the camping trip for months. I'd planned it down to the smallest detail, my first solo trip. It was something I'd always wanted to do. I found a remote spot deep in the national forest, miles from any town. I was excited, even if a little nervous about being completely alone out there. I thought it would be peaceful. The first day went fine. I drove up the winding dirt roads, parked my car, hiked out to where I'd set up camp, and got everything situated by late afternoon. It was a beautiful spot, tucked away from any trails, surrounded by thick trees with a small clearing for my tent and fire pit. It was exactly what I wanted, no noise, no people, just me in the woods. That night, I built a small fire, cooked some dinner, and settled in with a book. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the wind moving through the trees. It felt good to be alone with my thoughts. I didn't see anyone else all day, but as the sun started to set, I got this weird feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, being out in the wilderness with nothing but the forest around you, it makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, though, I woke up in the middle of the night to this strange noise outside my tent. It wasn't loud, more like a faint crunching sound, like someone or something was walking around, just outside the tent. I lay there, completely still, holding my breath. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing around. I waited for what felt like forever, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep, but it took a long time. My mind kept replaying the sound over and over. When I got up the next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around the campsite. There wasn't much out of place, but then I noticed something weird. There was this little pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing. I hadn't seen it there the day before. It was small, just 5 or 6 rocks stacked on top of each other, but it was definitely out of place. It wasn't there when I set up camp, I was sure of it. I told myself someone must have been camping here before me and left it behind. Maybe I hadn't noticed it when I got here. Still, it felt off. The whole thing gave me a bad feeling, but I wasn't going to pack up and leave over a pile of rocks. The rest of the day went pretty much the same as the first. I hiked around a bit, took some photos, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, branches rustling, and I'd stop in my tracks, heart pounding, scanning the trees. But there was never anyone there. By the time evening rolled around, I was feeling more on edge than I wanted to admit. I sat by the fire again, trying to relax, but that creeping feeling was still there, stronger now. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching. I went to bed early, hoping I'd sleep through the night, but it wasn't long before I was awake again. This time, I heard something different. It was a low, scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the ground. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to sit up and listen carefully. The sound was coming from outside, but it was close, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, slowly poking my head out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow around the camp. I swept the beam of the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. There was another pile of rocks, just like the first, only bigger this time, and it was right next to the door of my tent. The rocks looked fresh, like someone had just put them there while I was sleeping. I froze, scanning the trees with the flashlight, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was still, too still. I stood there for a minute, listening, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. My chest felt tight, and I could feel the panic rising in me. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night, stacking rocks around my tent? I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my tent, wide awake, gripping the flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept telling myself that as soon as the sun came up, I was getting the hell out of there. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, stiff and exhausted. The rock pile was still there, untouched, and now, in the daylight, it seemed even more unsettling. I quickly packed up my gear, throwing everything into my backpack as fast as I could. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever had done this came back. But as I was taking down my tent, I found something else. Right near the spot where I'd been sleeping, there was a small, crude carving in the dirt. It wasn't deep, just scratched into the ground with what looked like a stick or a rock, but it sent a chill down my spine. It was a symbol, like a crude circle with a line through it. I didn't know what it meant, but it was fresh, like it had been made that night while I was sleeping. I shoved the tent into my pack and threw it over my shoulder, practically running back to my car. As I hiked through the trees, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. Just the empty forest. When I reached my car, I practically threw my stuff into the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I took one last look at the trailhead before pulling out, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. I couldn't see their face, couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but they were there, standing perfectly still, watching me. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in cell service range. I called the park rangers, told them what had happened, but they didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably just some locals messing around, trying to scare campers. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate, like someone had been watching me, following me, leaving those rocks and that symbol as some kind of warning. I'd gone to the mall on a Saturday. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time. It was one of those big ones, 3 levels with stores packed on each floor and people everywhere. The kind of place where you could get lost if you weren't paying attention. I was wandering around, going from store to store, just browsing. I had already stopped at a couple of places, bought a coffee, and was walking toward the main area when I first noticed him. He was standing near the entrance of one of those trendy shoe stores, hands in his pockets, looking at me. I didn't think much of it at first. People look at each other all the time in a place like that. But then, a few minutes later, I was in another store, and I saw him again. He wasn't looking at anything, just standing by the entrance like he was waiting for someone. Only this time, it felt off because he was looking right at me again. I felt a bit of unease, but I shook it off. It was a crowded mall. Maybe he was waiting for a friend or just happened to be near me again. I kept moving, walking through the big open area with the fountain, toward the food court. I grabbed something to eat, sat down, and scanned the crowd. There were people all over, sitting at tables, kids running around, a group of teenagers laughing loudly a few tables over. Everything felt normal again. The weird feeling from before was fading. I took my time eating, scrolling through my phone. I'd almost forgotten about the guy when I looked up, and there he was again. This time, he was standing a little too close for comfort, near one of the trash bins at the edge of the food court. He wasn't eating or talking to anyone, just standing there. And he was staring straight at me. It wasn't subtle either. It was like he wanted me to know he was watching. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but the way he stood there, with his hands in his jacket pockets, not moving, made me feel like something wasn't right. I decided to test it. I got up quickly and walked out of the food court, heading toward one of the escalators. I didn't turn around to see if he was following, but after a minute or so, I glanced back, and there he was, keeping a distance but still there. My pulse sped up. I tried to stay calm. I told myself there was no way this guy could be following me. That stuff doesn't happen to regular people like me. But I couldn't shake the feeling now. I went into a clothing store and made a point to stay inside for a while. I wandered through the racks of shirts and jackets, pretending to look at stuff. After a few minutes, I walked toward the entrance and peeked out. My heart dropped. He was there, just standing outside, leaning against the wall. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic starting to rise. This wasn't normal. I felt trapped. I wasn't about to confront him. What would I even say? I wasn't going to cause a scene either, not yet. I needed to figure out how to lose him. I slipped out the back of the store and cut across to a department store on the other side of the mall. I figured if I could get to one of the exits, I could head to my car and leave. The idea of going back through the parking garage by myself was making me anxious, but I had no choice. I kept moving, weaving through people and trying to keep my distance. I didn't look back this time. I just wanted to get out. When I reached the department store, I went straight for the exit signs, walking faster now. I was almost there, just a few feet from the doors, when I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was closer now. Way closer. I could feel the sweat forming on my back as I pushed through the glass doors and out into the parking lot. The sunlight hit me, and for a second, I thought maybe I was safe. Maybe he'd give up and stop following me once I was outside. I kept moving, walking fast but trying not to run. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was freaked out. I was parked on the lower level of the garage, and as I reached the ramp that led down, I finally turned around to see if he was still there. He was. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My car wasn't far, but the garage felt huge. The sound of my footsteps echoed around me as I hurried to the corner where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my hands shaking. I glanced back again. He had followed me into the garage, and now he was walking faster too. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He wasn't just watching from a distance, he was coming straight toward me. I reached my car and tried to unlock it, but my hand was shaking so much that I dropped my keys. I cursed under my breath, bending down to pick them up as quickly as I could. By the time I straightened up, he was almost there, just a few feet away. I could see his face clearly now. He didn't look angry or upset, just blank, like he had no emotions at all. That scared me more than anything. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I managed to get the door unlocked and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I fumbled with the ignition, trying to start the car. It felt like my hands weren't working. The guy reached the car, his face inches from the driver's side window. He didn't knock, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring in at me, his hands still in his jacket pockets. I finally got the engine to turn over and threw the car into reverse. My tires screeched as I backed out of the spot, barely looking where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. As I sped away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing there, watching me drive off. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the mall, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to check the screen. It was a notification from the mall app. Thanks for visiting today. We hope to see you again soon. I deleted the app immediately and drove home, constantly checking the rearview mirror the whole way back. I don't know what that guy wanted, and I don't care. All I know is I'm never going back to that mall. I decided to go hiking one Saturday. I had planned this trip for weeks. I love being outdoors, and the state park was only a short drive from my house. The forecast promised clear skies and warm weather, so I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, and my camera. I felt excited as I drove to the park, ready for a day of exploration and fresh air. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. I noticed families setting up picnics, couples strolling hand in hand, and a group of kids laughing as they ran toward the trails. I grabbed my gear and checked the map at the entrance. I planned to take the Blue Ridge Trail, which was supposed to lead to a scenic overlook. I took a moment to study the map before heading down the path. At first, the trail was beautiful. The trees stood tall, and sunlight filtered through the leaves. The sound of birds chirping and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush made me feel connected to nature. I took my time, stopping occasionally to snap pictures of the vibrant flowers and the sunlight dancing on the leaves. I was in my element. After a while, I reached a fork in the path. The signs were a bit unclear, and I hesitated. I thought I saw a sign pointing to the right for the Blue Ridge Trail, but it was partly obscured by a low-hanging branch. I shrugged and chose the right path. How lost could I get in a state park? I figured I would just backtrack if I went the wrong way. As I continued along the trail, it became quieter. The cheerful sounds of families and laughter faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves. I started to notice the scenery was changing. The trees grew denser, the light dimmed, and I felt the air grow cooler. I checked my phone, but I had no signal. No one would find me unless I made a real effort to get back. I pushed forward, trying to enjoy the solitude. The path was narrower, and I noticed that it had not been maintained in some time. Fallen branches crunched under my feet, and the thick brush on either side closed in around me. I started to feel a sense of unease but tried to ignore it. Then, I heard voices. At first, they were faint and indistinct, but as I crept closer, I could make out a few words. I slowed my pace, curious and cautious. I did not want to stumble upon a group of hikers, only to interrupt their conversation. I pushed my way through the underbrush and kept to the edge of the trail, trying to stay hidden. I came upon a small clearing, and what I saw made my heart race. A group of men stood in a circle, talking quietly. They looked to be in their late 20s to early 30s. I could not see their faces clearly, but their body language felt tense. I noticed one of them had a large duffel bag at his feet, and another held a thick piece of wood that looked like a club. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but my curiosity held me in place. I ducked behind a tree, trying to remain hidden. They seemed to be discussing something important, but I could not make out their words. A few seconds later, I heard one of them raise his voice. "I told you to keep your mouth shut. We cannot let anyone find out." The others nodded in agreement, their eyes darting around as if they were worried someone would overhear. My heart pounded in my chest. What were they hiding? I wanted to leave, but I felt rooted in place, too terrified to move. Suddenly, one of the men stepped toward the tree where I was hiding. I held my breath, hoping he would not notice me. He looked around, scanning the area. I could see his face now, a strong jaw and piercing eyes. His expression was serious, and I could sense the danger radiating from him. I knew I needed to get away. I took a slow step back, trying not to make a sound, but a twig snapped underfoot. The man's head whipped around, and his eyes locked onto mine. I froze, my heart stopping for a split second. Panic coursed through me. I turned and ran, pushing through the branches and brush. I could hear their voices rise behind me, shouting at one another. "Did you see her? Where did she go?" I burst back onto the trail, adrenaline fueling my legs. I did not dare look back as I ran deeper into the woods. My mind raced as I tried to find my bearings. I knew I had to get back to the main path, but my legs felt heavy, and I was terrified they would find me. I ran for what felt like forever, ducking under branches and leaping over roots. The trail became a blur as I focused solely on getting away. I could still hear them behind me, crashing through the underbrush, voices echoing in the woods. "Don't let her get away." I was nearing the fork in the trail when I stumbled. I caught myself but fell hard against a tree, pain shooting through my shoulder. I glanced back and saw one of the men emerging from the brush. His face was filled with rage, and he was closing the distance fast. Desperately, I pushed myself off the ground and darted down the left path, the one I had not taken before. It felt like a gamble, but it was all I had left. I ran and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail twisted and turned, and I focused only on getting away from them. I could hear the man shouting to the others behind me. They were still following, but the voices were becoming quieter, as if they were losing hope. I felt a surge of determination. I had to get back to safety. Eventually, I broke through the trees and stumbled into an area that felt more open. I saw a small sign that indicated I was near the entrance to the park. Relief washed over me, but I knew I could not stop yet. I kept moving, my legs aching but my heart pounding with the knowledge that I was almost safe. Finally, I spotted the parking lot in the distance. My car sat there, like a beacon of safety. I sprinted toward it, not caring about the pain in my side or the tears that threatened to spill from my eyes. I reached my car, grabbed the handle, and fumbled with my keys. I finally unlocked it and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors and looked around frantically, half expecting to see the men burst from the trees at any moment. My hands shook as I inserted the key into the ignition and started the engine. I peeled out of the parking lot, glancing back only once to see if they were following. They were nowhere in sight. I drove home, every nerve in my body still tingling from fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. As I reached my neighborhood, I felt the weight slowly lift. I was finally safe, but the encounter lingered in my mind. I never hiked in that park again. I avoided the outdoors for a long time, and when I did go back, I made sure to stay close to populated areas where I felt safe. Sometimes I still think about that day and the men in the woods. What were they hiding? Why were they so intent on keeping me from leaving? It started like any normal neighborhood potluck. I had been living in the neighborhood for about 6 months at this point. It wasn't the friendliest place, but people waved at each other and said hello when they passed by. Nothing too deep, no close friendships. It was fine, really. I didn't mind keeping to myself. One of the neighbors, Sarah, had knocked on my door a week before the event and invited me to the potluck. She seemed nice enough, kind of the unofficial ringleader of the block. When she asked if I would come, I figured, why not? It'd be a chance to meet more people, and honestly, I'd been feeling kind of lonely since I moved here. The potluck was set up in Sarah's backyard, long tables covered in all kinds of food. I brought a pasta salad, nothing special. People milled around, making small talk, filling their plates. I was mostly keeping to myself, sitting at the edge of the group, not feeling super comfortable yet, but still glad I came. It felt good to be out of the house. After a while, I noticed something strange. It wasn't obvious at first, but after I started looking closer, I realized that almost all of the dishes had meat in them. Like, everything. It wasn't just the usual stuffed burgers or ribs, you know, the kind of thing you expect at a barbecue. It was weird stuff too, like meat in things that usually didn't have it. There was a meat pie, meat in the potato salad, even some weird jello thing with chunks of meat inside. I'm not a vegetarian or anything, but it struck me as odd. It was like they'd all gone out of their way to put meat in every dish. I tried not to think too much about it. I mean, maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it was some sort of running joke between them that I didn't get. I shrugged it off, grabbed a plate, and started picking through the things that looked the least weird. As I was eating, I noticed that some of the neighbors were watching me. Not in an obvious way, but every now and then, I'd look up and catch someone glancing at me. They'd look away quickly, but it happened enough times that it started to bother me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't know these people well, and it's not like I was the most outgoing person. Maybe I just wasn't used to being around a lot of people. But the more I sat there, the more uncomfortable I felt. Something wasn't right. After about an hour, Sarah came over and sat next to me. She had this big, too friendly smile on her face, the kind of smile that felt practiced, like she'd been putting it on all night. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked. I nodded, not wanting to seem rude, but I was starting to get the urge to leave. I glanced down at her plate, and I noticed that she wasn't eating anything. Not a bite. Her plate was full, but untouched. I looked around, and that's when it hit me. None of the neighbors were really eating. They were all holding plates, pushing food around with their forks, but no one was actually eating. At least, not the ones who lived here. I started to feel a knot in my stomach. Something was seriously wrong. I made an excuse about needing to get home, something about having to work early the next morning. Sarah's smile faltered just a bit, like she hadn't expected me to want to leave so soon. But she didn't argue. "Of course," she said, "but before you go, you should really try this." She reached over to the table and picked up a small dish. It was some kind of stew, thick and dark, with chunks of meat floating in it. "This is my grandmother's recipe," she said, her voice soft and warm, like she was offering me some kind of gift. I hesitated, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I took the spoon she handed me and dipped it into the stew. The smell hit me first. It was rich, but there was something off about it, something metallic. I stirred the spoon around, and a piece of meat floated to the surface. It didn't look like any meat I'd ever seen before. I put the spoon down. "I think I'm okay, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah's smile didn't drop, but her eyes did something. They hardened, just for a second, before she pulled the dish back toward her. "Suit yourself," she said, her voice light again, like nothing had happened. I stood up, muttering something about needing to go. As I turned to leave, I saw one of the other neighbors, a man I hadn't met before, standing by the edge of the yard, watching me. He wasn't smiling. He just stared at me, his eyes following me as I walked away. I made it home, locked the door behind me, and sat down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whole night felt like a bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker going on. The way they watched me, the way no one ate, the meat in every dish, it was all wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out if I was just imagining things or if there was something seriously wrong with my neighbors. The next day, I did some digging. I didn't even know where to start, but I figured I'd try looking up the history of the neighborhood, see if anything strange had ever happened there. It was a long shot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't find much at first, just a few mentions of the area in some old news articles. But then I stumbled across an old police report from about 10 years ago. There had been a missing persons case. A woman who had lived in the neighborhood had vanished without a trace. They never found her. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. There were other reports too, more disappearances over the years. None of them were connected, at least not officially, but they all had one thing in common: they had all lived in the same neighborhood. My neighborhood. I was starting to feel sick. I closed my laptop, trying to push the thoughts out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about the potluck. The meat. The way they watched me. I didn't go outside for a few days after that. I didn't want to see my neighbors, didn't want to risk running into Sarah or anyone else. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. Then, a few nights later, I heard a knock on my door. I didn't answer at first. I just stood there, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the window and peeked through the blinds. It was Sarah. She was standing on my porch, smiling that same too friendly smile, holding a dish covered in foil. "I made too much for dinner," she called out, her voice muffled through the door. "I thought you might like some." I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, frozen, as she knocked again, her smile never fading. "I know you're home," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song tone. "Why don't you open the door?" I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The knocking continued for a few more minutes, then finally, it stopped. I waited, listening, until I heard her footsteps fade away. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't say goodbye. I just got in my car and drove. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was far away from there. I don't know what was going on in that neighborhood, but I'm sure of one thing: I was never meant to leave that potluck alive. I didn't really want to go camping, but my friend Sarah convinced me. She found this spot in the woods, a little clearing off some trails we hadn't been to before. She swore it was the perfect place for a quiet weekend. I wasn't sure about it. We hadn't done much camping, but Sarah said she'd figured it all out, borrowed a tent from a friend, got some supplies. It was just supposed to be a 2-day thing, and honestly, I just wanted to spend time outside, away from work. We left on a Friday afternoon, threw everything in the car, and drove about 2 hours out of the city. The last part of the drive was down a long, gravel road, and we didn't see another car the entire time. I remember thinking how empty everything felt, but I figured that's what camping was about, getting away from people. It was a bit later than we planned when we finally got to the spot, just after 6 in the evening. The sun was still out, but it was starting to dip, and we knew we had to set up camp fast. The clearing was nice enough. It wasn't too far from a stream, and the trees gave it a kind of enclosed feeling. Sarah was excited, talking about how peaceful it was. There was no one else around. We pitched the tent, laid out the sleeping bags, and got a small fire going with the wood we found nearby. I started to feel better. It was quiet, and the smell of the pine trees mixed with the smoke from the fire made it feel right. We cooked some food, drank a bit, and by the time the sun had fully set, we were both feeling relaxed. I think we both needed the break from everything. Sarah had brought her Bluetooth speaker, and we played some music, laughing about how we were roughing it, even though we weren't really. It was around 10 p.m. when things started to feel off. We had just started to get ready for bed when we heard footsteps coming from the woods. Not animals, people. Sarah and I exchanged a look. Who else would be out here? We hadn't seen anyone for hours. Two men came out of the trees. They looked rough, dirty clothes, unshaven faces, like they'd been out here for a while. One of them, the taller one, had this smirk on his face as they got closer. The other just stared at us without saying a word. "Looks like you ladies picked the wrong spot," the tall one said. His voice was calm, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. "This is private land." Sarah stood up, trying to keep her cool. "We didn't see any signs," she said. "We didn't know. We'll pack up and leave right now." The taller guy chuckled. "Oh, it's too late for that. You've already set up camp. This here's our land, and you're trespassing." He took a step closer, hands in his pockets, like he had all the time in the world. "There's a fee for that." "What?" I blurted out. "We don't have any money." His smile faded. "I think you can come up with something." Sarah stepped in front of me. "We'll leave," she said, her voice steady. "Right now. We didn't mean to trespass, but we'll go." "You don't need to." The other guy, the quiet one, finally spoke. "You're not going anywhere." His voice was low, almost a growl. He stepped forward, closer to the fire. "Not until we get what's ours." I felt my stomach drop. Sarah kept trying to talk to them, but they weren't listening. The tall guy circled around us, looking at the tent, the fire, our bags. He was sizing everything up like it was his. The quiet one just stared at us, his eyes cold and flat, like we were nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "You girls don't have much, do you?" the tall one said, now standing behind me. I felt his eyes on the back of my neck, and I froze. Sarah didn't move either. It felt like we were trapped, standing there in the dark with these two men. The quiet one finally spoke again. "You're gonna pay us, or things are gonna get worse." Sarah reached for her phone, trying to make it look casual, but the tall guy noticed right away. He grabbed it out of her hand and tossed it into the woods. "No need for that," he said with that smirk again. "We can settle this right here." I could feel my heart racing, and my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't think. Sarah was trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't sure what to do either. "We don't want any trouble," Sarah said. "We'll leave all our stuff. You can have it. Just let us go." The tall guy leaned in close to me. I could smell his breath, sour and stale. "That's not how this works," he whispered. That was when Sarah made a move I'll never forget. Without warning, she grabbed the small camping shovel we had near the fire and swung it at the tall guy, hitting him in the side. He let out a grunt and stumbled backward, clutching his ribs. The quiet guy lunged at her, but I reacted without thinking. I grabbed one of the sticks from the fire, still burning on the end, and swung it at him. He jumped back, avoiding the flame, but it gave us enough time to make a break for it. We ran, leaving everything behind, our bags, our tent, all of it. I could hear them shouting behind us, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Sarah was right behind me, and we just kept running through the trees, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away. We must have run for 20 minutes straight before we finally stopped to catch our breath. I looked around, but there was no sign of them. We were deep in the woods now, no trail, no path, just trees and darkness. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We have to get back to the car." We didn't have our phones. We didn't have a flashlight. But we couldn't go back to the camp. So, we kept walking, trying to find our way through the dark. It felt like hours, stumbling through the woods, every little sound making us jump. I kept expecting to see those men again, to hear their voices, but the forest stayed silent. Finally, we found the dirt road. I don't know how long it took us, but it was still dark when we reached it. We followed it back to where we had parked the car. It was still there, untouched. We jumped in, locked the doors, and drove. We didn't say a word until we were miles away, back on the highway, heading home. We never reported it. We didn't know who those men were, and we didn't want to go back to that place ever again. We lost all our stuff, but it didn't matter. We got out, and that was enough. When I got home that evening, I was tired. It was one of those days where work just dragged on, and all I wanted to do was make dinner and relax. I parked in my usual spot, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door. Nothing felt off at first. The street was quiet, and the sun was just starting to set. Everything looked normal. I unlocked the door and walked in, kicking off my shoes like I always do. I tossed my keys on the little table by the door and started heading to the kitchen. The house was quiet, too quiet, maybe, but I didn't notice it right away. I had this habit of zoning out after work, just thinking about nothing, so I wasn't paying much attention. Then I heard a soft clinking sound. At first, I thought it was something outside. Maybe the wind had knocked something over, or maybe a neighbor's dog was messing around. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the kitchen. I stopped walking, my heart picking up a little. It was strange. I hadn't left anything out that could make noise. I took a few more steps, slow, careful, and that's when I saw it. There was someone sitting at my kitchen table. I froze, standing in the doorway, staring. It took a second for my brain to catch up, to make sense of what I was seeing. A man, someone I'd never seen before, was just sitting there, in my kitchen, like he belonged there. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, my cup, and he was casually stirring it with a spoon. He looked up when he saw me, his face calm, almost relaxed. He smiled, a small, polite smile, like this wasn't completely insane. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and friendly. "You're home early." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, my mind racing. Who was this guy? How did he get into my house? My first thought was maybe I'd left the door unlocked, but that didn't make sense. I always lock up when I leave. I finally managed to say something, though my voice came out shaky. "Who are you?" The man didn't seem bothered by the question. He just kept stirring his coffee, like this was the most normal thing in the world. "I could ask you the same thing," he said. "But I won't. I already know." That threw me off. My stomach tightened, and I felt a cold sweat starting on the back of my neck. Something was wrong, really wrong. This wasn't some confused neighbor who'd wandered into the wrong house. This guy knew what he was doing. I took a step back, my hand instinctively going to my phone in my pocket. "You need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how you got in here, but you need to go. Now." He didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, studying me, like he was trying to decide something. "Why would I leave?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious. "I have every right to be here." That sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. Every right to be here? What the hell was he talking about? "This is my house," I said, my voice rising. "You don't belong here." The man sighed, finally putting the spoon down. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms, still perfectly calm. "You're mistaken," he said. "You think this is your house, but it isn't." "Not really." I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline kicking in. I needed to get him out, but I didn't want to push him too hard. There was something off about the way he spoke, something that made me feel like he wasn't all there. I had no idea what he was capable of. "Look," I said, trying to reason with him, "I don't know what you think, but this is my house. I've lived here for 3 years. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but you need to go before this gets worse." The man's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, something darker. 3 years, huh? He said, almost to himself. "That's cute." I took another step back, my hand gripping my phone tighter. "I'm calling the police." His eyes flicked down to my hand, and he smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. "Go ahead," he said. "Call them. But by the time they get here, you'll wish you hadn't." That was it. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait any longer. I pulled my phone out and started dialing, my hand shaking. But before I could hit the call button, he stood up. It was fast, too fast. 1 second he was sitting calmly at the table, and the next, he was on his feet, moving toward me. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet as I backed into the hallway. Wait, he said, holding his hands up like he was trying to calm me down. But there was something in his eyes now, something that wasn't right. "We don't need to do this. We don't need to make this ugly." I didn't say anything. I just kept backing up, my finger hovering over the call button. "I've been here a long time," he said, taking another step forward. "Longer than you know. This house, it's not yours. It's never been yours. You're just a guest." I felt a wave of nausea hit me, and I pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, and then he lunged. He was fast, but I moved faster. I bolted down the hallway, slamming the door to the living room behind me as hard as I could. I heard him crash into it a second later, the sound of his fists pounding against the wood. "Open the door," he shouted, his calm voice now replaced with something cold and sharp. "You can't stay in there forever." I ran to the front door, throwing it open and stumbling outside. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the driveway, not even daring to look back. I made it to the street just as the operator answered, and I screamed into the phone, telling them someone was in my house. The police arrived in minutes, though it felt like hours. I stood outside, trembling, watching as they stormed the house, guns drawn. I expected to hear shouts, maybe even gunfire. But instead, they came out a few minutes later, looking confused. "There's no one in there," one of the officers said, his brow furrowed. "We checked every room. The place is empty." I stared at him, my mind spinning. That's impossible. He was right there, in the kitchen. The officer shook his head. "We didn't find anyone." Are you sure you saw? I'm sure, I snapped, my voice shaking. He was there. He said it wasn't my house. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and I could see the doubt in their eyes. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand, but I didn't have the energy. I was too shaken, too scared. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd just been stressed or tired. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. I packed a bag and went to a friend's place, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, somewhere, waiting. I never went back to that house. I was driving back from Fairbanks. It was late, probably close to midnight. The highway was mostly empty, nothing but the open road stretching for miles ahead. The sky was this deep shade of blue, fading into black, and the only sound was the low hum of the car engine. It wasn't unusual for me to drive at night in Alaska, especially on this highway. Not a lot of traffic, just long stretches of road with nothing around but trees and mountains in the distance. I had left a little later than I planned, and now it was getting colder. I could feel the temperature dropping even with the heat on in the car. The darkness out there, it was thick. It felt like you could reach out and touch it. The headlights barely cut through it, just illuminating a few feet ahead before the blackness swallowed everything else. I was about an hour or so away from my destination when I saw it. A pile of debris in the middle of the road. Logs, branches, rocks, stuff that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a landslide, it looked like someone had put it there deliberately, like a makeshift roadblock. I slowed down, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Something about it didn't feel right. This wasn't some random stuff that had just fallen from the trees. The logs were neatly stacked, the branches arranged like someone had taken the time to make it look like an accident. I stopped the car, the engine still running. I thought about just driving around it, but the way the logs were positioned, it would have been hard. And the last thing I needed was to get stuck out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service. I glanced at my phone, but as expected, there were no bars. I put the car in park and got out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I zipped up my jacket and started walking toward the roadblock, trying to figure out the best way to move some of the debris out of the way. I didn't see anyone around, just the trees on either side of the road, stretching out into the darkness. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading away from the pile and into the forest. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were deep, like someone had been standing there recently, watching. My heart started to race. I stood up, scanning the tree line, but it was too dark to see much of anything beyond the first few rows of trees. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone had tried to clear the road earlier and then gave up. But something about it didn't sit right. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back to the car, ready to just forget about the whole thing and try to drive around the mess. That's when I saw the truck. It was parked a little ways behind my car, its headlights off, just sitting there in the dark. I hadn't heard it pull up. I hadn't seen it on the road. It was like it had appeared out of nowhere. The driver's side door opened, and a man got out. He was tall, wearing a thick coat and a beanie, but I couldn't make out much of his face in the darkness. He started walking toward me, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Need some help?" he called out, his voice carrying through the cold night air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know this guy. I didn't know where he'd come from, and something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, set off alarm bells in my head. "No, I'm good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got it." He kept walking toward me, ignoring what I'd said. He was maybe 20 feet away now, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "You sure? Looks like a pretty big mess to clear on your own." His tone was casual, but there was something off about it. Too casual, like he was trying too hard to sound helpful. I said, "I'm fine," I repeated, a little louder this time. He stopped, just standing there, watching me. We stared at each other for a moment, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Then he smiled. It was a small, tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you are." That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. The roadblock, the truck, the footprints, it was all planned. He'd been waiting for someone to come along, someone like me. I took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to get back to the car, lock the doors, and get the hell out of there. But before I could move, I heard something behind me, a rustling in the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I whipped around, but I couldn't see anything. Just the dark outline of the trees, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But the footsteps were getting closer, faster, like someone was running toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted for the car, my boots slipping on the icy pavement. I could hear the man behind me now, his footsteps quickening as he gave chase. I reached the car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. I yanked it open and dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The man was standing just a few feet away from the car now, his face illuminated by the glow of my headlights. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was blank, cold. He took a step closer, and I could see something glinting in his hand. A knife. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away from the roadblock. The man lunged forward, slamming his hand against the window, but I was already moving, the car skidding as I turned and sped down the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going, just away from him, away from that roadblock and those footprints leading into the forest. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I finally let myself breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. I decided to go hiking alone to clear my head. Work had been tough, and I needed some time away. I picked a trail in the mountains that wasn't too crowded. The weather was nice, and the path looked easy. I took my backpack with water, some snacks, and a map. I planned to be gone for a day or two, nothing more. After a few hours on the trail, I found a part that was less maintained. The trees were thick, and birds were singing all around. I felt calm walking through the woods. The sounds of the forest were soothing. As I walked, I saw a small cabin off the main path. It looked old, with wood that was worn and a chimney that wasn't used anymore. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which was strange for such a remote place. Curious, I approached the cabin. I parked my backpack and walked closer. The door was slightly open, so I knocked gently. An elderly man opened the door. He looked older than I thought, with a gray beard and tired eyes. He welcomed me inside without asking questions. The cabin was small, with a simple table, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove. It smelled like old wood and something else I couldn't identify. He introduced himself as Jack, a retired park ranger. He said he had lived here for years, watching over the forest and helping hikers when needed. He seemed kind but distant. I felt a bit uneasy but didn't say anything. We sat down, and he offered me some tea. I accepted, grateful for the hospitality. As we talked, I noticed gaps in his stories. He said he had been a ranger for over 30 years, but when I asked about his family, he couldn't remember much. He mentioned having children, but the details were vague. Sometimes, he would pause and look away, trying to recall something. I told him about my hike and how I needed to clear my mind. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally. After a while, he stood up and said he needed to check something outside. I watched him go to the back of the cabin and noticed he left the door slightly open again. I started to feel uneasy. It was late afternoon, and I had been sitting there for hours. I asked if I could stay the night, but he seemed hesitant. He said it was late and that I should probably head back. I insisted, saying I could stay for a few more minutes. He finally agreed, but his eyes seemed distant. I looked around the cabin more carefully. There were old photos on the wall, but they were faded and hard to see. I saw pictures of a man in a ranger uniform, and some with families, but the faces were blurry. One photo showed a group of hikers, but it was too old to make out who they were. As evening approached, the light outside faded, and the temperature dropped. I decided to leave before dark. I thanked Jack for the tea and stood up to go. He seemed to regain some of his composure and smiled, telling me to be safe on the trail. I walked towards the door, but it was harder to open than before. I pushed, and it creaked loudly. Inside, it was dark, and I felt like something was wrong. I hurried to the back door, thinking it might be easier to exit that way. But as I reached for the handle, Jack was standing there. He looked angry now, his face hard. He said I shouldn't have come here, that it was dangerous. I tried to stay calm, explaining I just wanted to leave, but he wouldn't listen. He started to speak quickly, words not making much sense. I realized he was agitated, maybe scared. I backed away, trying to find another way out. The cabin seemed smaller now, the walls closing in. I saw a window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. Jack moved towards me, his eyes wild. I knew I had to get out before he did something. I grabbed my backpack and ran to the door, pushing past him. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back, but I managed to break free and sprint outside. The forest was dark, and I didn't know which way to go. I ran through the trees, branches hitting my face and cutting my arms. My heart pounded as I tried to find the trail again. I didn't stop running until I saw the main path ahead. I followed it quickly, not looking back. The sounds of Jack's footsteps were behind me, getting closer. I kept running, ignoring the pain from my cuts. Finally, I reached a clearing where I could see the trail clearly. I followed it until I reached a familiar spot. The trail led me back to the main road, where I found my car. It was dark now, and I got in, locking the doors. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far from the cabin. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked back in my mind at what had happened. Jack said he was a park ranger, but something about his story didn't fit. His memory was unclear, and his behavior was strange. When I ran, I felt like he knew I discovered something, like he had secrets he couldn't share. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin or Jack. I just kept to myself, trying to forget what happened. But sometimes, I still think about that cabin and the old man who didn't seem to belong. I'm glad I got out alive, but the memory still haunts me. I never went back to that trail, and I hope no one else does either. The island is beautiful, but it's hiding something dark. I just want to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me that day. In the end, I made it home safe, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something bad. I still don't know what Jack was really doing there or why he reacted the way he did. All I know is that I was lucky to get out when I did. And that's my story. I'm still trying to make sense of everything that happened. It's hard to put it into words because I'm not even sure I understand it myself. But I need to get it out, I guess. Maybe someone else will see this and have some idea of what went wrong. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Me and my best friend, Emily, had planned it for months. We both loved hiking, and the cabin was perfect, secluded, surrounded by woods, no cell service. We wanted to disconnect from everything. We've been friends for years, and this was something we always did. A tradition, I guess you could say. The cabin was about a 5-hour drive from the city. We arrived late in the afternoon, got settled in, and spent the evening going over our hiking plans. We had a route mapped out, just a few hours hike through the trails, and we'd come back to the cabin to relax. The first day went perfectly. The weather was great, the trails were easy, and everything felt peaceful. It was the second day when things went wrong. We woke up early, excited to tackle a longer trail that went deeper into the woods. It was marked on the map, but we hadn't tried it before. Emily was more adventurous than me, always pushing us to go further or try something new. I trusted her judgment, she was good with directions, and I never worry about getting lost with her. The trail started off fine. We were walking for maybe 2 hours, talking and laughing, when Emily decided she wanted to go off trail to explore a bit. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along. She always did this, and it never caused any issues before. We walked off the path, through thick trees and uneven ground. I started to feel uneasy. The woods were dense, and it felt like we were farther from the trail than I wanted to be. Emily kept moving ahead, calling out how amazing everything looked, how we should keep going. At some point, I lost sight of her. I was looking down at my feet, trying not to trip over roots, and when I looked up, she wasn't there. I called out her name, expecting her to respond with some joke about how slow I was. But she didn't answer. I called her name again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind in the trees. I wasn't panicking yet. I thought she must have just gone ahead a little too far, and I'd catch up. I started walking faster, shouting her name, but every time I stopped to listen, all I heard was the quiet of the woods. It was too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the trees and the wind. After what felt like forever, I realized I was completely alone. I turned around, thinking maybe she'd circle back without me noticing, but the way back looked different. I couldn't tell where the trail was anymore. Everything looked the same. That's when the panic started to set in. I kept calling for her, louder and louder, my voice echoing through the trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but I must have gotten turned around somewhere. Nothing looked familiar anymore. I kept walking, hoping to find the trail, but every direction felt like it was leading me deeper into the woods. Hours passed. My legs were sore, my throat was dry from shouting, and I still hadn't seen any sign of Emily. I started thinking about what to do, stay put or keep moving. I didn't have my phone with me since we knew there was no service, and even if I had it, it wouldn't help out here. I felt stupid for not being more cautious, for not insisting we stick to the trail. As the sun started to set, I knew I needed to get back to the cabin. Emily had to be there by now, probably wondering where I was. Maybe she had made it back before me and was waiting, worried. That's what I told myself as I finally found my way back to what I thought was the main trail. I was wrong. The trail I found wasn't the one we had started on. It was narrower, overgrown, and led me in a direction I didn't recognize. I followed it anyway, figuring any path was better than none. But it didn't take me back to the cabin. It just kept winding deeper into the woods, and the light was fading fast. By the time I realized I was completely lost, it was almost dark. My mind was racing, thinking of all the stupid survival tricks I'd heard over the years. Stay put, find shelter, wait for help. But I couldn't stay out there. I had to find Emily. I had to get back to the cabin. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I saw it, just a flicker of light through the trees. I almost cried in relief. The cabin. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking from exhaustion. I ran up the steps and yanked open the door, expecting to see Emily sitting inside, maybe annoyed that I had taken so long. But the cabin was empty. Everything was exactly how we had left it that morning. Her backpack was still by the door, her jacket hanging on the hook. But she wasn't there. My heart sank. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty cabin, trying to figure out what to do. And that's when I saw it. Her phone. It was sitting on the porch, right where I would have seen it when we left that morning. I hadn't noticed it when I first came up because I was so focused on getting inside. I picked it up, confused. She never went anywhere without her phone, even if there was no service. The screen lit up when I touched it, and I saw a string of messages she had apparently sent to me. But I never got them. My phone was inside, in my bag, and there was no way either of us had a signal out here. I scrolled through the texts, my heart pounding. They started off normal enough. She'd sent a couple of pictures of the trail earlier in the day, followed by, "You okay? Where'd you go?" But then they got stranger. "Seriously, where are you? I'm freaking out. Answer me. Someone's out here." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the last few messages. "I see him. He's watching me. He's getting closer. Please come back." That was the last one. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. It didn't make any sense. Emily never sent those messages. We had been together the whole time, and there was no one else out there. No one had been following us. At least, I hadn't seen anyone. But the messages were real. They were on her phone, right there in front of me. I ran inside the cabin and grabbed my own phone, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. No service. I checked my bag to see if I had missed any messages, but there was nothing from Emily. Nothing from anyone. I was completely cut off. I didn't know what to do. I paced around the cabin, checking the windows, locking the door, trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Had someone really been following us? Was Emily still out there somewhere, lost and scared? I waited for hours, hoping she would come back. But she never did. As the night wore on, I kept hearing noises outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps. Every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. At one point, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow passing between the trees, too quick to get a good look. My heart raced as I stared out into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I froze, my blood running cold. No one should have been out there. Emily was still missing, and there was no one else for miles. I crept toward the door, my hands trembling. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I didn't open it. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The knocking stopped, and the cabin was silent again. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a kitchen knife I had found in one of the drawers. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every little sound made me jump, convinced that someone was outside, watching, waiting. By morning, there was still no sign of Emily. I packed up my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. I just needed to get out of there. I called the authorities as soon as I had a signal, but they never found her. They searched the woods, questioned me, and went over everything, but there was no trace of Emily. It was like she had disappeared without a trace. And I still don't know who or what sent those messages. I booked a red-eye flight, thinking it'd be quiet. I just wanted to sleep the whole way, get to my destination without much fuss. The airport was pretty empty when I got there, just a few people wandering around the terminal. It felt nice, like I had the place to myself. I boarded the plane, found my seat in the middle of the cabin, and settled in by the window. It was one of those smaller planes, with just 2 seats on each side. A guy took the seat next to me right before takeoff. I didn't think much of it. He was wearing a hoodie, jeans, looked normal enough, maybe a few years older than me. He smiled as he sat down, and I gave a polite nod back, hoping that would be the end of our interaction. The lights dimmed, and we were getting ready for takeoff. I put my headphones in, leaned back, and closed my eyes. It was late, and I was tired. Just as I started to drift off, I felt a tap on my arm. I opened my eyes and pulled out an earbud. "Where are you headed?" the guy asked. I hesitated, not wanting to get into a conversation. "Just visiting family," I said, hoping that would shut it down. He nodded but didn't stop. "Do you fly often?" "Sometimes," I mumbled, putting my earbud back in, but he tapped me again almost immediately. "You ever been in a crash?" That question threw me off. I stared at him for a second, unsure if he was serious. "No," I said flatly, trying to end it. He chuckled, like he thought it was a joke. "You ever wonder what it'd feel like?" I felt a chill run through me. "No, not really." "Well," he said, leaning closer, "I think about it sometimes. You know, how fast it would all happen. If you'd even feel it." I didn't know what to say. His tone wasn't playful. It was too casual, too interested in the idea. I shifted in my seat, trying to inch away from him without making it obvious. I looked around, but the cabin was dark, and everyone else seemed to be either sleeping or watching their in-flight entertainment. I put my earbuds back in, louder this time, hoping he'd get the message. For a few minutes, he stayed quiet, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, I felt him tap me again, harder this time. I took out my earbuds, annoyed. "What?" "Do you ever think about what people are really like?" he asked, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. "Like, what they're hiding?" I stared at him, not sure what he was getting at. "What do you mean?" He leaned even closer, so close I could smell his breath. "Everyone's got something, right? A secret. Something dark." His eyes were wide, staring at me like he was waiting for me to agree. "What do you think people hide from the world?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing at the flight attendant who was busy at the front of the plane. I thought about asking to switch seats, but I didn't want to make a scene. "I don't know," I muttered, trying to turn away. "I bet you've got something," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Everyone does. Something you don't want anyone to know." I felt my stomach turn. "Can you stop?" I asked, my voice shaky. He smiled, a slow, creepy smile that made my skin crawl. "What are you afraid of?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing, and I felt trapped, boxed in against the window. I pressed the call button for the flight attendant, praying she'd come quickly. I needed to get away from him. The flight attendant came over after what felt like forever. I asked if I could switch seats, told her I wasn't feeling well and needed some space. She looked around the cabin and gave me an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but the flight is full," she said quietly. "There's nowhere to move you." My heart sank. I nodded, trying to keep calm, but as soon as she walked away, I felt his eyes on me again. "You tried to leave," he whispered. "Why would you do that?" I didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, trying to focus on anything but him. My hands were trembling, and I was gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles were white. He kept going, his voice barely audible, but I could hear every word. "You think they'll protect you? There's no one here but us." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore him. I thought about calling the flight attendant again, but I was too scared to move, scared he'd get angry if I did. The plane was dark, and the hum of the engine was the only sound, but all I could focus on was his breathing, his presence looming next to me. For the next few hours, I barely moved. Every time I shifted, I could feel him watching me, like he was waiting for me to react, to show him I was afraid. I could sense his eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look at him. The flight felt like it was never going to end. Every minute dragged on, and I felt trapped, like there was no escape. I kept my head down, focused on my breathing, trying to convince myself that I'd be okay, that nothing was going to happen. When we finally started descending, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I could see the lights of the city below, and I knew we'd be landing soon. I just had to get through the next few minutes. But then, as we were about to land, he leaned in one last time. His breath was warm against my ear. "I know where you're going," he whispered. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even move. When the plane finally landed, I grabbed my bag and practically ran off, not caring if I looked panicked. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I just kept moving, straight out of the airport, into a cab, and away from there as fast as I could. I never saw him again, but I haven't flown since. And I don't think I ever will. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for about 3 days. It was early autumn, and the weather was perfect: cool mornings, warm afternoons, and the leaves just starting to turn. I wasn't in a rush, just taking my time. I'd always wanted to do this, hike the trail on my own, clear my head. I wasn't in the best place mentally, so this trip was supposed to be a break from everything. On the third day, I came across a group of 4 people. They looked like locals, 2 men and 2 women, all in their 30s or 40s. They were standing near the trailhead, chatting, and one of them waved as I approached. They seemed friendly enough, asked how my hike was going, where I was headed. I told them I was just following the trail, taking it slow, enjoying the quiet. One of the men, who introduced himself as Ray, said there was a better spot to camp a little off the trail, a place with fewer people, a great view of the valley. He said most people missed it because it wasn't marked on the map. The others nodded along, like they were all in on some local secret. They didn't seem threatening, just friendly, eager to show me a place I wouldn't find on my own. I didn't see any reason not to trust them. I'd read that locals were often helpful to hikers, offering advice and even directions to hidden spots. So, when they offered to show me the way, I agreed. We walked for about half an hour, following a path that was barely visible, winding through the trees. They made small talk, asked about where I was from, what brought me to the trail. It all felt normal, but there was something nagging at the back of my mind. Something about how quiet the woods had gotten, how the air seemed heavier the further we went. After a while, the path started to disappear completely. It became just leaves and undergrowth, no sign that anyone had walked there before. I slowed down a bit, starting to feel uneasy. Ray noticed and smiled at me, saying we were almost there. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. The others had stopped talking by then. They were walking in front of me, their backs to me, silent. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was overreacting. It was just an unfamiliar part of the woods, that's all. Eventually, we reached a small clearing. It wasn't much of a view, just some rocks and trees, no valley like they'd mentioned. I looked around, confused, and asked if this was the spot they'd been talking about. Ray nodded, but there was something off in the way he looked at me. Like he was waiting for something. I set my pack down, trying to act casual, but my heart was racing. The air felt wrong, like it was pressing down on me. I glanced at the others, and they were just standing there, watching me. None of them had unpacked anything or even sat down. They were just staring. I decided I didn't want to camp there after all. I made up some excuse about wanting to keep moving, maybe find a spot closer to the main trail. As I bent down to pick up my pack, I felt someone behind me, too close. I turned around and saw Ray, standing way too close, his eyes locked on mine. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low. The others moved in closer, surrounding me. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen this coming at all. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. My phone had no signal, and even if it did, I knew no one would get there in time. I forced a smile and tried to play it off, saying I'd stay a little longer, but I needed to make sure I got back on the trail before dark. Ray didn't smile back. He just stepped even closer, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. The other man, who hadn't said much until now, spoke up. "We don't like strangers out here," he said, his voice cold. "You shouldn't have come with us." I knew then that I was in serious danger. I glanced around, looking for an escape route, but they had me boxed in. There was no way I could outrun them, not with my pack on, and I didn't know the terrain. Without thinking, I swung my pack at Ray, hitting him square in the chest. He stumbled back, surprised, and I took off running, darting through the trees. I didn't know where I was going, but I just ran, my breath coming in gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I heard them shouting, crashing through the undergrowth as they chased me. My legs were burning, my lungs on fire, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close they were. The woods were thick, branches whipping in my face and arms as I pushed through. I tripped over roots, stumbled on rocks, but somehow I kept going. I didn't know how far I'd run or where I was, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. Eventually, I found myself back on the trail, though I had no idea how I'd gotten there. I didn't hear them anymore, but I didn't slow down. I kept running until I was sure they weren't behind me, until my legs finally gave out, and I collapsed on the path, gasping for breath. I didn't sleep that night. I set up camp just off the trail, but I didn't feel safe. Every sound made me jump, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I kept my knife in my hand, ready for anything. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't bother with the rest of the hike. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and those people as possible. I never saw them again, but I'll never forget the way they looked at me, like I was something they owned. Something they were going to take. It started as a regular day. My daughter, Lily, and I went to the park just like we always did when the weather was nice. She loves to run around, feed the ducks, and climb the jungle gym. It was one of those big parks with a lake in the middle, benches lining the walking trails, and trees everywhere. It's the kind of place where you see the same faces, moms with strollers, joggers, old men fishing. Nothing unusual. We've been going there since she was a baby, so I never thought anything could go wrong. I let Lily run ahead like she always did. She was wearing her bright yellow jacket, the one I got her for her birthday. I liked that it was so easy to spot. She'd run, then stop and wait for me, never too far ahead. Always within my line of sight. But that day, I turned to answer a text. I swear it was just a second. When I looked up, Lily wasn't there. At first, I wasn't too worried. Maybe she had just ducked behind a tree or was sitting on a bench. Kids do that, they get distracted by something small, and you find them picking flowers or staring at a bug. I walked a little faster, calling her name. Lily. I expected her to pop out, giggling like she always did when she tried to scare me. But she didn't answer. I picked up the pace, heading toward the playground. I could see all the kids running around, climbing the jungle gym, but Lily wasn't one of them. I scanned the area, nothing. My heart started to pound. I called her name louder this time, but no response. I told myself not to panic. There were people around, other parents. Someone would have seen her if she'd wandered off. I asked a mom nearby if she'd seen a little girl in a yellow jacket. She shook her head, looking a bit concerned. I tried the man walking his dog, a group of teenagers sitting by the fountain. No one had seen her. Minutes started to blur together. My voice got hoarse from yelling her name. People began to notice, offering to help look, but no one had seen where she went. I kept walking, checking every corner of the park, every trail, but with each step, I felt the panic rising. It didn't make sense. She was right there. She had been right in front of me. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on a bench near the trees, a man in his 40s maybe, dressed in a jacket and jeans, kind of scruffy looking. He was watching me, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I don't know why, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. But I was desperate, so I walked over to him. "Did you see a little girl?" "Yellow jacket, brown hair, about 5? I asked, my voice shaky. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting the question. "Yeah, I saw her." My heart jumped. "Where? Did she run off? Where did she go?" He stood up, his hands shoved in his pockets. "She got into a van," he said, his voice low. The world seemed to stop for a second. My brain couldn't process what he just said. "A van?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. He nodded again. "Yeah. I saw a van pull up on the other side of the park. She got in with some guy." I felt my legs go weak. My stomach churned. "What do you mean she got in? Why didn't you stop her? What kind of van? What did the guy look like?" He didn't seem fazed by my panic. He just shrugged. "I don't know, man. Just a van. White, maybe. I think it went toward the north exit." I wanted to scream, to grab him and shake him. Why hadn't he done something? Why hadn't anyone seen this happen? But instead, I grabbed onto the one piece of information I had at the north exit. I started running. I didn't wait for him, but he followed me, jogging to keep up. "You're going to need help," he said. "I can help you look." I didn't care who helped me. All I could think about was finding that van, finding Lily. I ran through the park, weaving through the trees and past the lake, barely able to see straight through the tears filling my eyes. We reached the north exit, but there was no van. No sign of anything unusual. I spun around, looking in every direction, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The man stood beside me, watching me with those same calm eyes. "You sure it was the north exit?" I asked him, my voice trembling. "Maybe it was another one?" He nodded slowly again. "Yeah, it was this one. But they might have left already." I felt like I was going to collapse. The ground felt like it was slipping out from under me. But something about his answer didn't sit right. Why hadn't he done more? Why was he so calm about all this? I looked at him closely for the first time. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. His hands were scratched, his nails filthy. He wasn't acting like someone who had just witnessed a child being taken. "Why didn't you do anything?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shrugged again. "I didn't think it was my place. Thought maybe she knew the guy." My blood ran cold. That didn't make any sense. If he saw a child getting into a van with a stranger, why wouldn't he have tried to stop it? Why didn't he tell someone sooner? I took a step back from him. "Did you see the guy's face?" I asked, my voice firmer now. He shook his head. No. He was wearing a hat. Could have been anyone. I didn't believe him. Something was off. I could feel it in my gut. I backed away from him, glancing around the park, but there was no one else nearby. Just the two of us, standing by the exit, with no sign of Lily or the van. I need to call the police, I said, pulling out my phone. He didn't react. He just stood there, watching me with those same cold eyes. Yeah, maybe you should, he said. But there was something in his voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I dialed 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I gave the dispatcher all the information I had, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I kept glancing at the man, half expecting him to do something, but he just stood there, watching me. When I hung up, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, though. It was something else, something that made my skin crawl. They'll find her, he said. Or they won't. Hard to say with these things. I stepped back again, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. Kids disappear all the time. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? He didn't answer. He just smiled that same unsettling smile and walked away, disappearing into the trees like he'd never been there at all. I waited for the police. They combed the park, checked the exits, but there was no van. No sign of Lily. The man was gone, too, like he'd never existed. I tried to tell them about him, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They said he was probably just a drifter, someone who saw something and misunderstood. But I knew better. I never found out what happened to Lily. They never found the van, and the man never showed up again. It's been months now, and every day I wonder if she's still out there, or if that man had something to do with it. All I know is that I'll never forget the way he smiled at me, like he knew something I didn't, like he knew I'd never see her again.